Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to explore one of hip-hop's most enduring mysteries, a case that remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades until a breakthrough in 2023. This is the story of Tupac Amaru Shakur, whose life was cut short on a warm September night in Las Vegas in 1996. So let me tell you about a night that changed music history forever. The neon lights of Las Vegas painted the desert night in brilliant colors. It was a Saturday evening, and the city buzzed with its usual electric energy. At the MGM Grand Garden Arena, boxing fans had gathered for what many expected to be an exciting heavyweight championship bout between Mike Tyson and Bruce Seldon. Among those in attendance was a 25-year-old rapper whose star had risen meteorically in just a few short years, Tupac Amaru Shakur. At about 8:30 p.m., Shakur and Knight took their front row seats at the fight at the MGM Grand Garden Arena. Shortly afterward the fight began. It would end less than 2 minutes later, with Tyson winning in a first-round knockout. The crowd erupted as Tyson claimed victory in what would be remembered as one of the shortest heavyweight championship fights in boxing history. Tupac was there as a guest of Marion "Suge" Knight, the imposing CEO and founder of Death Row Records, the label that had become Tupac's musical home. Knight was a controversial figure in the music industry, a man who commanded both respect and fear, known for his aggressive business tactics and connections to street culture. That night, he wore a red shirt, representing his affiliation with the Bloods gang, while Tupac was dressed more casually. The fight had been electric, but brief. Tyson easily defeated Seldon by first-round knockout in one of the shortest heavyweight championship fights in boxing history, lasting just 1 minute 49 seconds. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement as people began to filter out of the arena, but for Tupac, the real drama of the evening was just beginning. After the fight ended, Tupac and his entourage made their way to congratulate Tyson backstage. Tupac went backstage at 8:45 p.m. after fight hugged Tyson and then headed to lobby of hotel with crew. It was in the MGM Grand Lobby that fate would set in motion the events that would lead to tragedy. As they walked through the crowded lobby, one of Knight's associates spotted a young man who would become a central figure in this story, Orlando Anderson, known on the streets as Baby Lane. Anderson was a member of the Southside Compton Crips, a gang that had ongoing conflicts with Death Row Records and their blood affiliations. Shakur was told Anderson had been involved in trying to steal a Death Row Records pendant months earlier, a major infraction in the hip-hop world. Shakur and Knight were moved to confront Anderson. In the world of 1990s hip-hop, jewelry wasn't just fashion, it was a symbol of success, respect, and territorial marking. The alleged theft of a Death Row pendant was seen as a serious disrespect that demanded a response. What happened next was captured on the MGM Grand security cameras, a moment that would be analyzed and reanalyzed for decades to come. Tupac, flanked by members of his crew, approached Orlando Anderson near the hotel's entrance. Words were exchanged, tensions escalated, and suddenly, the situation exploded into violence. This is where the fight started between Tupac and Orlando Anderson. A security camera recorded the incident on tape. The fight was stopped by hotel security, and Orlando was held for questioning. The beating was swift and brutal. Anderson was knocked to the ground and kicked repeatedly by Tupac and several members of the Death Row entourage. Hotel security quickly intervened, separating the combatants and restoring order to the lobby. For most observers, this might have seemed like just another scuffle in a city known for its late-night altercations. But in the context of Los Angeles gang culture and the volatile world of West Coast rap, this brief confrontation had set something much more dangerous in motion. After the incident in the lobby, Orlando Anderson was briefly detained by hotel security but was ultimately released without charges. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police would later say that Anderson chose not to press charges against Tupac and his associates. To casual observers, it might have seemed like the matter was closed. Tupac and Suge Knight, meanwhile, prepared to continue their evening. They had plans to attend a party at Club 662, a nightclub owned by Knight. The club was located several miles away, and they would need to travel through the heart of Las Vegas to get there. The mood in Tupac's circle seemed celebratory despite the earlier confrontation. They had enjoyed a spectacular boxing match, had seemingly settled a score from months earlier, and were now looking forward to a night of partying. Tupac was riding high. His latest album, All Eyes on Me, had been a massive commercial success, and he was already working on new material. But across town, in the shadows of Las Vegas, other conversations were taking place. Phone calls were being made. Plans were being discussed. The confrontation at the MGM Grand had not gone unanswered, and retribution was being organized with frightening efficiency. Around 10:30 p.m., Tupac and Suge Knight left the MGM Grand. They climbed into Knight's black BMW sedan, a powerful, imposing vehicle that matched Knight's larger-than-life persona. Tupac rode in the front passenger seat, while Knight took the wheel. They were part of a small convoy of cars carrying various death row associates and bodyguards. The night air was warm, typical for Las Vegas in early September. The windows of the BMW were rolled down, and Tupac was in good spirits, rapping along to music and joking with Knight as they drove. This detail would later prove significant. In a city where drive-by shootings were not uncommon, having the windows down made the car's occupants visible and vulnerable. As they traveled through the neon-lit streets of Las Vegas, heading toward Club 662, neither Tupac nor Knight seemed aware that they were being followed. Somewhere in the maze of casino-lined boulevards, another car, a white Cadillac, was tracking their movements with deadly intent. The convoy made its way through the heart of Las Vegas, past the towering hotels and casinos that made the city famous. The Strip was alive with its usual Saturday night energy, tourists walking between casinos, couples heading to late dinners, gamblers hoping for lucky streaks. It was a scene of celebration and excitement, completely at odds with the dark drama that was about to unfold. On September 7, 1996, at 11:15 p.m. PDT, Tupac Shakur, a 25-year-old American rapper, was shot in a drive-by shooting in Paradise, Nevada. The shooting occurred when the car carrying Shakur was stopped at a red light at East Flamingo Road and Koval Lane. The intersection was unremarkable, just another traffic light in a city full of them. East Flamingo Road was a busy thoroughfare, and even at this hour, there was a steady flow of traffic. The BMW came to a stop at the red light, engine idling, music playing softly from the radio. It was then that the white Cadillac pulled up alongside them. What happened next lasted only seconds, but those seconds would reverberate through music history for decades to come. A white Cadillac sedan pulled alongside and fired into Shakur's car. The night erupted in a symphony of violence, the sharp crack of gunshots, the shattering of glass, the screaming of tires. 14 shots rang out in rapid succession. The bullets tore through the passenger side of the BMW, and Tupac bore the brunt of the assault. 4 bullets found their target, striking him in the chest, arm, and thigh. 1 bullet grazed Suge Knight's head, causing him to lose control of the vehicle momentarily. In the chaos that followed, Knight managed to make a U-turn and speed away from the intersection, desperately trying to get Tupac to a hospital. The white Cadillac, meanwhile, had vanished into the Las Vegas night as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only shell casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Suge Knight, blood streaming from his head wound, drove frantically through the streets of Las Vegas, searching for the nearest hospital. Tupac, conscious but badly wounded, was fighting for his life in the passenger seat. The hip-hop mogul would later describe these moments as the longest of his life, watching his friend and biggest star struggle to breathe while navigating unfamiliar streets in a damaged car. Instead of going directly to the nearest hospital, Knight made a decision that investigators would question for years to come. Rather than stopping immediately for medical help, he attempted to drive back toward Death Row's neighborhood, possibly seeking help from associates or trying to reach a hospital he was more familiar with. This delay, though it lasted only minutes, may have been crucial in determining Tupac's fate. Eventually, Knight spotted a bicycle patrol officer and flagged him down. The officer immediately called for an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics were on the scene. They found Tupac conscious but in critical condition, his breathing labored and blood loss significant. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him before rushing him to University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. During the ambulance ride, Tupac remained conscious and even spoke briefly with the paramedics. However, he refused to cooperate with police investigators who arrived at the hospital. When asked who had shot him, Tupac reportedly invoked the street code of silence, essentially telling officers he wouldn't provide any information about his attackers. At University Medical Center, Tupac was immediately taken into surgery. The medical team worked through the night and into the following days, performing multiple operations to repair the damage caused by the 4 bullets. The injuries were severe, his right lung had been punctured, there was significant internal bleeding, and other organs had been damaged. For several days, there were hopeful signs. Tupac was placed in a medically induced coma to help his body heal, but doctors initially believed he might recover. Bulletins from the hospital suggested that while his condition was critical, there was reason for optimism. Fans around the world held vigil, waiting for news about their beloved rapper. Radio stations played his music continuously, and impromptu memorials appeared outside record stores and on street corners in cities across America. The hip-hop community rallied together, with even Tupac's rivals expressing hope for his recovery. His mother, Afeni Shakur, maintained a constant bedside vigil. A former Black Panther and civil rights activist, she had named her son after Tupac Amaru II, an 18th-century revolutionary who had fought against Spanish oppression in Peru. Now she watched as her son, who had become a revolutionary voice in his own right, fought the most important battle of his life. Despite the medical team's best efforts, Tupac's condition began to deteriorate. On September 13, 1996, Shakur died of respiratory failure that led to cardiac arrest after the removal of his right lung. Doctors attempted to revive him but could not stop the hemorrhaging. His mother, Afeni, made the decision to cease medical treatment. 6 days after that fateful night in Las Vegas, Tupac Amaru Shakur was pronounced dead at 4:03 p.m. He was just 25 years old, an age when most people are just beginning to discover their potential, but Tupac had already created a legacy that would influence generations. The news of his death sent shockwaves around the world. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to announce the tragic news. Fans gathered outside record stores, many in tears, sharing memories of what Tupac's music had meant to them. Fellow artists paid tribute to a talent taken too soon, and even those who had feuded with him acknowledged the magnitude of the loss. In death, Tupac became larger than life. His final album, recorded in the months before his shooting, would be released posthumously and become one of the best-selling rap albums of all time. But questions about his murder would linger for decades. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation, but from the beginning, they faced significant challenges. The most obvious obstacle was the reluctance of witnesses to cooperate. In the world of 1990s hip-hop, talking to police was seen as a betrayal of street code, and this cultural barrier made gathering evidence extremely difficult. Suge Knight, the only other person in the car and the key witness to the shooting, provided minimal cooperation to investigators. He later claimed he hadn't seen the shooters clearly and couldn't provide useful descriptions. This lack of cooperation from the primary witness severely hampered the investigation from its earliest days. The physical evidence was also limited. Shell casings were recovered from the scene, and investigators were able to determine that the shots had been fired from a .40 caliber Glock pistol. However, the murder weapon was never recovered, and without witnesses willing to testify, investigators struggled to build a case. Detectives explored various theories about the motive for the shooting. The most obvious connection was to the altercation with Orlando Anderson earlier that evening at the MGM Grand. Anderson was questioned by police, but he denied any involvement in the shooting and provided an alibi for his whereabouts at the time of the attack. As the official investigation stalled, numerous theories began to emerge about who was responsible for Tupac's murder. Some focused on the East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry that had been dominating headlines in the months before the shooting. Tupac had been engaged in a highly publicized feud with East Coast rapper the Notorious B.I.G. and his label, Bad Boy Records. Others pointed to gang connections and street-level conflicts that had little to do with the music industry. Shocker's shooting stems from a conflict between two gangs based in Compton, California, and investigators believe that the MGM Grand altercation had triggered a retaliatory response from Crips gang members. Conspiracy theories also flourished, ranging from the plausible to the bizarre. Some suggested that Tupac had been targeted by law enforcement agencies who saw him as a dangerous revolutionary voice. Others claimed that his own record label had been involved in his death due to financial disputes or power struggles. The lack of arrests or charges in the case only fueled more speculation. How could such a high-profile murder, committed in full view of witnesses on a busy Las Vegas street, remain unsolved? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. As months turned into years, the Tupac Shakur murder investigation gradually faded from the headlines. Detectives continued to work the case, but without new leads or witness cooperation, progress was minimal. The case file grew thick with reports and theories, but no closer to resolution. A Los Angeles Times investigation published in 2002 determined that uncooperative witnesses and minimal pursuit of gang-related leads resulted in what became an unresolved homicide case. The newspaper's investigation revealed systemic problems with how the case had been handled, including a failure to adequately pursue gang connections and a lack of coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The cold case status was particularly frustrating for Tupac's family and fans. Here was one of the most famous people in America, killed in a public place, yet his killers remained free. The contrast between the resources devoted to solving murders of less famous victims and the apparent inability to solve this high-profile case raised troubling questions about the criminal justice system. Meanwhile, Tupac's musical legacy continued to grow. Posthumous albums were released regularly, each one climbing the charts and introducing his music to new generations of fans. His influence on hip-hop culture was undeniable, but the shadow of his unsolved murder hung over everything. For nearly 3 decades, the Tupac Shakur murder case remained officially unsolved. Occasionally, there would be renewed media attention, a documentary would air, or a book would be published claiming to have new evidence, but no arrests were made. During this period, several key figures in the case died. Orlando Anderson, the young man who had been beaten at the MGM Grand, was killed in an unrelated shooting in Compton in 1998. Other potential witnesses and suspects also died, taking their secrets with them to the grave. The passage of time seemed to make resolution of the case less and less likely. Evidence degraded, memories faded, and the cultural context that had made Tupac's murder seem so significant in 1996 began to feel like ancient history to younger generations. But investigators never completely gave up. Cold case detectives would periodically review the file, looking for new angles or overlooked evidence. Advances in forensic technology offered hope that physical evidence from the scene might eventually yield new leads. A grand jury in Las Vegas has indicted the last living suspect in the 1996 killing of Tupac Shakur in a long-awaited breakthrough in one of hip-hop's most enduring mysteries. In September 2023, nearly 27 years after the murder, Las Vegas police announced that they had finally made an arrest in the case. A grand jury has indicted Dwayne Keith Kef D. Davis on charges of murder with use of a deadly weapon in connection with the 1996 killing of rapper Tupac Shakur. The arrest of Davis, now 60 years old, marked the first time anyone had been charged in connection with Tupac's murder. Davis was not a new name in the investigation. He is the last known survivor of the people thought to be in a car from which someone shot at Shakur. For years, investigators had suspected that Davis knew more about the shooting than he had initially admitted, but they had been unable to build a case strong enough to bring charges. What changed was Davis himself. In recent years, he had begun talking publicly about the night of the murder, writing a book and giving interviews in which he provided details about the shooting that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. Davis wrote a book about the rapper's killing detailing street gang life and the murder. In his memoir and subsequent interviews, Davis had essentially confessed to being present in the white Cadillac on the night of the shooting, though he stopped short of admitting to personally pulling the trigger. According to Davis's own statements, the shooting was indeed retaliation for the beating of Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand. Davis claimed that Anderson was his nephew, and that the family honor demanded a response to the public humiliation he had suffered. Davis described how quickly the retaliation was organized. Within hours of the MGM Grand incident, according to his account, a plan was put in motion to track down Tupac and Suge Knight. The white Cadillac was obtained, weapons were gathered, and the hunt began. Chief Deputy District Attorney Mark DiGiacomo described Davis as the on-ground, on-site commander who ordered the death. Even if Davis hadn't personally fired the fatal shots, prosecutors argued that his role as the organizer and commander of the attack made him equally culpable under Nevada law. Davis's arrest in September 2023 brought a mixture of relief and skepticism from those who had followed the case for decades. On one hand, it represented the first real movement toward justice in nearly 3 decades. On the other hand, many wondered whether a successful prosecution was possible so many years after the crime, with most witnesses dead and physical evidence degraded. Davis appears in Clark County District Court to plead not guilty to murder charges for his alleged involvement in the killing of rapper Tupac Shakur in 1996. His legal team argued that his previous statements were nothing more than the boastful claims of an aging man trying to enhance his street credibility, not actual confessions to murder. The prosecution faced significant challenges. Most of their case appeared to rest on Davis's own statements, which his defense attorneys would undoubtedly argue were unreliable. The physical evidence from 1996 was limited, and nearly all the potential witnesses were dead. However, prosecutors expressed confidence that they could secure a conviction. They had spent months building their case before bringing charges, and they believed that Davis's detailed knowledge of the crime, combined with other evidence, would be enough to convince a jury of his guilt. As the legal process continues, Tupac Shakur's influence on music and culture remains as strong as ever. His posthumous albums have sold millions of copies, and his lyrics continue to resonate with new generations of fans who discover his music decades after his death. The themes that Tupac explored in his music, social justice, police brutality, urban poverty, and the struggle for dignity in the face of systemic oppression, remain relevant today. His artistic legacy has transcended the circumstances of his death, though the mystery surrounding his murder had always been part of his mystique. For many fans, the arrest of Dwayne Davis brought a sense of closure that had been missing for decades. While it couldn't bring Tupac back, it represented a step toward justice and accountability for one of hip-hop's greatest tragedies. Tonight, as we reflect on the murder of Tupac Shakur, we remember not just the circumstances of his death, but the power of his life. In just 25 years, he had created a body of work that would influence countless artists and speak to the experiences of millions of people around the world. His story is ultimately one of unfulfilled potential, of a young man whose artistic gifts and social consciousness might have led him to even greater achievements had he lived. We can only imagine what additional music he might have created, what films he might have starred in, what social causes he might have championed. But even in death, Tupac's voice continues to echo. His music plays on, his message of hope and resistance continues to inspire, and his memory serves as both a celebration of artistic achievement and a reminder of the senseless violence that too often cuts short promising lives. The arrest of Duane Davis may finally provide some measure of justice for this decades-old crime. But regardless of the outcome of the legal proceedings, Tupac Amaru Shakur's legacy remains secure, not as a victim of violence, but as an artist whose brief but brilliant career illuminated the struggles and dreams of his generation. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that sometimes the most powerful legacies are created not by those who live the longest, but by those who burn the brightest while they're here. Tupac's light may have been extinguished on that September night in Las Vegas, but its influence continues to shine, inspiring new artists, new movements, and new hope for a better world. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the warm September air of Pensacola, Florida, the year 2017 was supposed to mark a new beginning for Taylor Wright. At 33 years old, she had weathered the storm of a difficult divorce and was finally emerging on the other side, ready to rebuild her life from the ground up. Taylor had made the transition from police officer to private investigator, a career that suited her analytical mind and determination to seek truth in a world that often obscured it. The coastal city of Pensacola, with its white sand beaches and historic downtown, seemed like the perfect place for fresh starts. Taylor had recently begun living with her girlfriend, Cassandra Waller, a school administrator who brought stability and warmth into Taylor's life after years of turbulence. Their relationship had not been without challenges. Taylor's past struggles with infidelity and occasional drug use had tested their bond, but they had worked through these issues together, committed to building something real and lasting. Those who knew Taylor described her as a woman of contradictions. She was tough enough to handle the demanding world of law enforcement and private investigation, yet vulnerable enough to trust deeply in her personal relationships. Standing at just over 5 feet tall, she possessed a fierce determination that belied her petite stature. Her colleagues respected her work ethic, and her friends cherished her loyalty. But it would be this very loyalty, this willingness to trust those closest to her, that would ultimately seal her fate. The story that would unfold over the coming months began not with malice, but with trust. During her contentious divorce proceedings, Taylor had found herself in a financial predicament that many people face during the dissolution of a marriage. When a judge froze the assets she shared with her ex-husband, Jeff Wright, Taylor made what seemed like a prudent decision at the time. She withdrew $100,000 from their joint account before the freeze took effect, hoping to protect some of her financial future. But having that much cash on hand created its own problems. Where could she safely store such a significant sum while the legal proceedings continued? The answer came in the form of a trusted friend, Ashley MacArthur, a woman who seemed like the perfect confidant for such a sensitive matter. Ashley was not just any friend, she was someone Taylor had known from their shared professional background in law enforcement. At 40 years old, Ashley had previously worked as a crime scene technician for the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. This background in forensics and police work created an immediate bond of professional understanding between the two women. Ashley understood the stresses of law enforcement life, the weight of seeing humanity at its worst, and the challenges of maintaining personal relationships while working in such a demanding field. Their friendship had developed over time, built on this shared professional foundation and deepened through personal conversations about life, relationships, and dreams for the future. When Taylor needed someone trustworthy to safeguard $34,000 of her money, Ashley seemed like the natural choice. After all, who better to trust than someone who had dedicated their career to protecting and serving the community? So, in what would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of her life, Taylor placed $34,000 in Ashley's care. It was meant to be temporary, just until the divorce proceedings concluded and Taylor could safely access her own funds again. Ashley assured her friend that the money would be secure, that Taylor could retrieve it whenever she needed it. For a while, this arrangement seemed to work perfectly. Taylor focused on her new career as a private investigator, taking on cases that challenged her investigative skills while allowing her the independence she craved. She threw herself into building her new life with Cassandra, trying to leave behind the painful chapters of her marriage and create something better for herself. But beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding. Ashley MacArthur was facing financial pressures of her own, pressures that would prove too tempting to resist when faced with easy access to someone else's money. Unknown to Taylor, Ashley had not simply stored the $34,000 in a safe place as promised. Instead, she had deposited it into her own bank account and had begun spending it. The money that was meant to be Taylor's security became Ashley's solution to her own financial problems. Month after month passed, and the money dwindled as Ashley used it for her personal expenses. What started as perhaps a temporary borrowing, in Ashley's mind, something she might have told herself she would eventually replace, became a growing deception that would require increasingly desperate measures to maintain. By the late summer of 2017, the legal proceedings surrounding Taylor's divorce were reaching a critical juncture. The court was demanding that the money Taylor had withdrawn be returned, which meant she needed to retrieve the $34,000 from Ashley's care. When Taylor made this request, Ashley's carefully constructed deception began to crumble. Time and again, Ashley found excuses for why the money wasn't immediately available. She stalled, deflected, and made promises about retrieving the funds soon. But each delay increased the pressure on both women. Taylor was facing potential legal consequences if she couldn't produce the money for the court, while Ashley was confronting the reality that she had betrayed one of her closest friends in the most fundamental way possible. The psychological weight of this situation cannot be understated. For Taylor, what had begun as a reasonable request to retrieve her own money was becoming a source of increasing anxiety and confusion. Why was Ashley, who had always been reliable and trustworthy, suddenly being evasive about something so straightforward? The stress of the ongoing divorce proceedings was already taking its toll on Taylor's mental and emotional well-being, and now she was facing the additional burden of a friend who seemed to be letting her down when she needed support most. For Ashley, the situation had moved far beyond a simple financial mistake. She was now living with the constant fear of exposure, knowing that her deception would inevitably come to light. The money was gone, spent on expenses she could never justify to Taylor or to herself. Each conversation with Taylor became a minefield, requiring careful navigation to avoid the truth while maintaining the facade of friendship. As September 2017 progressed, the tension between the two women reached a breaking point. Taylor's patience with Ashley's delays and excuses was wearing thin, and she was beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong. The court was demanding the return of the money, and Taylor's legal situation was becoming increasingly precarious. She needed that $34,000, and she needed it immediately. It was against this backdrop of mounting pressure and betrayed trust that the events of September 8, 2017, would unfold. On what would prove to be the last day of Taylor Wright's life, she made plans to meet with Ashley MacArthur one final time. The stated purpose was straightforward: Taylor would collect her money and resolve this increasingly complicated situation once and for all. The morning of September 8 began like any other for Taylor and Cassandra. They were still in the process of fully moving in together, surrounded by boxes and the pleasant chaos of combining two lives into one home. Taylor seemed optimistic about finally resolving the money situation with Ashley. After weeks of delays and excuses, she believed that today would be the day she would retrieve her funds and put this stressful chapter behind her. Cassandra later recalled that Taylor seemed slightly anxious about the meeting, but not unusually so given the circumstances. The stress of the divorce, the court proceedings, and now this complication with Ashley had been wearing on Taylor, but she appeared determined to handle the situation directly and definitively. She dressed casually for the day, wearing a simple outfit and a distinctive necklace that she often wore, a piece of jewelry that would later become crucial evidence in the investigation that would follow. Before leaving the house, Taylor and Cassandra made tentative plans for the evening. They would continue unpacking, perhaps order dinner from their favorite restaurant, and enjoy a quiet night together. These mundane, everyday plans, the kind that couples make without thinking, would take on a tragic poignancy in the hours and days to come. Taylor met Ashley in the early afternoon, and according to Ashley's later statements to police, they spent several hours together that day. Ashley claimed that they had gone to various locations around Pensacola, running errands and catching up as friends do. She painted a picture of a normal, pleasant afternoon spent in the company of someone she cared about. But investigators would later piece together a very different narrative of that day's events. Rather than a casual afternoon between friends, September 8, 2017, was the day that Ashley MacArthur decided to resolve her financial crisis in the most permanent and horrific way possible. Unable to return the money she had stolen and unwilling to face the consequences of her betrayal, Ashley had concluded that there was only one way to make the problem disappear entirely. Evidence would later reveal that Ashley had been planning Taylor's murder for some time. In conversations with another acquaintance, Ashley had discussed methods of killing her friend. She had even considered adding cocaine to Taylor's beer, believing that Taylor's past struggles with substance abuse would make such a death appear accidental or even self-inflicted. This level of premeditation demonstrated the calculated nature of what would transpire. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of panic, but a coldly planned murder. When direct poisoning seemed too risky or unreliable, Ashley settled on a more straightforward method. She obtained a firearm, something that wouldn't be difficult for someone with her law enforcement background, and made her final preparations for the unthinkable. The exact details of what happened during Taylor and Ashley's final meeting may never be fully known, as Ashley never provided a truthful account of the events. But investigators believe that at some point during their afternoon together, Ashley led Taylor to a secluded location where she could carry out her plan without witnesses or interruption. Perhaps Taylor had grown insistent about the money, demanding immediate action rather than accepting another excuse. Perhaps she had begun to piece together the truth about Ashley's deception and was threatening to expose her to authorities. Or perhaps Ashley had simply decided that this was the day she would eliminate the only person who knew about her theft. Whatever the final conversation between the two women entailed, it ended with Ashley MacArthur shooting Taylor right in the back of the head. The crime was brutal in its efficiency and devastating in its betrayal. Taylor, who had trusted Ashley with her money and her safety, never saw the attack coming. Her death was instantaneous, a small mercy in what was otherwise a completely merciless act. But committing murder was only the first part of Ashley's problem. Now she had to dispose of Taylor's body and create a plausible explanation for her friend's disappearance. Drawing on her background in crime scene investigation, Ashley believed she could cover her tracks and avoid detection. Ashley wrapped Taylor's body in a hammock, perhaps thinking this would slow decomposition or make the remains more difficult to identify if they were discovered. She then transported the body to a farm property in a rural area outside Pensacola, where she buried Taylor in what she hoped would be a permanent grave. The location Ashley chose for the burial was remote and unlikely to be disturbed by casual passers-by. It seemed like the perfect place to hide the evidence of her crime indefinitely. After completing the burial, Ashley returned to her normal life, preparing to play the role of a concerned friend when Taylor's disappearance was inevitably reported. When Taylor failed to return home that evening, Cassandra initially wasn't overly concerned. Taylor had mentioned that she might be late, and it wasn't unusual for her to lose track of time when dealing with stressful situations. But as the hours stretched on and Taylor didn't answer her phone, Cassandra's concern grew into genuine worry. By the next morning, when Taylor still hadn't returned home or made contact, Cassandra knew something was seriously wrong. Taylor was responsible and communicative, especially during this period when they were building their life together. She would not simply disappear without explanation, particularly not when she had important legal matters to resolve. Cassandra contacted the Pensacola Police Department to report Taylor missing. The initial response was somewhat routine: adults have the right to disappear voluntarily, and 48 hours hadn't yet passed since Taylor was last seen. But Cassandra's description of Taylor's character and circumstances convinced investigators that this was not a case of someone choosing to walk away from their life. Detective work began immediately, with investigators trying to establish a timeline of Taylor's final day. Phone records showed that Taylor had been in contact with Ashley MacArthur throughout September 8, and Ashley quickly emerged as the last person known to have seen Taylor alive. When police contacted Ashley for information about their day together, she readily agreed to speak with them. Ashley's initial cooperation with the investigation was exactly what one would expect from an innocent friend who was concerned about a missing person. She appeared genuinely worried about Taylor's welfare and provided what seemed like helpful information about their time together on September 8. According to Ashley, she and Taylor had spent a pleasant afternoon running errands and catching up, but Taylor had seemed distracted and stressed about her ongoing legal problems. Ashley told investigators that she had dropped Taylor off at a location where Taylor planned to meet someone else, though she claimed not to know who that person was or what the meeting was about. This story provided a reasonable explanation for why Ashley was the last known person to see Taylor, while also directing suspicion toward an unknown third party. For several days, this narrative held up under initial scrutiny. Ashley appeared to be nothing more than a helpful friend who was cooperating fully with the investigation. She provided phone records, answered questions about Taylor's state of mind, and even helped search for any clues about Taylor's whereabouts. But investigators are trained to look beyond surface appearances, and several aspects of Ashley's story began to trouble them as they dug deeper into the case. Phone records showed that Taylor's phone had gone silent shortly after her final contact with Ashley, which seemed unusual if Taylor had indeed been dropped off to meet someone else. Additionally, there were no other confirmed sightings of Taylor after her afternoon with Ashley, despite the fact that Pensacola is a relatively small community where people tend to know each other. As days passed without any sign of Taylor, the investigation intensified. Missing person cases are always challenging, but this one had several factors that made it particularly complex. Taylor's background in law enforcement meant she was trained in personal safety and situational awareness. She was not someone who would easily fall victim to random crime or who would disappear voluntarily without careful planning. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives began examining Taylor's financial situation more closely. The stress surrounding her divorce proceedings was well documented, but investigators discovered that there was more to the story than simple marital discord. Court records revealed that Taylor had withdrawn a substantial sum of money from joint accounts and that this money was supposed to be returned to the court as part of the divorce settlement. When investigators asked Taylor's family and friends about this money, they learned about Taylor's arrangement with Ashley MacArthur. The fact that Ashley had been trusted with $34,000 of Taylor's money added a new dimension to the investigation. Financial motives are among the most common reasons for violent crime, and the timing of Taylor's disappearance, just as court pressure was mounting for the money to be returned, seemed too coincidental to ignore. Detectives approached Ashley with more pointed questions about the money she was holding for Taylor. They asked to see documentation of the arrangement, inquired about the current location of the funds, and requested bank records to verify Ashley's claims about safeguarding the money. It was at this point that Ashley's cooperation with the investigation began to wane. Rather than providing straightforward answers about the money, Ashley became evasive and defensive. She claimed that the financial arrangement was private between her and Taylor, and that she didn't feel comfortable discussing details without Taylor's permission. When investigators pointed out that Taylor was missing and that understanding her financial situation might be crucial to finding her, Ashley maintained her position that she couldn't violate Taylor's privacy. This change in Ashley's demeanor raised red flags for investigators. Someone who had been eagerly helpful when discussing Taylor's whereabouts was suddenly uncooperative when the topic shifted to money. Detectives obtained a warrant for Ashley's bank records, and what they discovered confirmed their growing suspicions. The records showed that Ashley had indeed deposited a $34,000 cashier's check made out to Taylor right into her own checking account. Rather than holding the money safely for her friend, Ashley had spent it on personal expenses over the course of several months. By September 2017, the money was entirely gone, and Ashley's account showed no ability to repay such a substantial sum. This discovery transformed the missing person investigation into a potential homicide case. Ashley MacArthur had motive, means, and opportunity to harm Taylor Wright. She had stolen a significant amount of money from someone who was increasingly demanding its return. She had the knowledge and connections to obtain weapons through her law enforcement background, and she had been the last person seen with Taylor on the day of her disappearance. Confronted with the evidence of her financial theft, Ashley's story began to change. She admitted to taking the money but claimed it was a temporary loan that she had always intended to repay. She insisted that Taylor had agreed to the arrangement and that there was no conflict between them about the money. According to Ashley's new version of events, Taylor had understood Ashley's financial difficulties and had been patient about getting the money back. But this revised story contradicted other evidence that investigators had gathered. Friends and family members confirmed that Taylor had been increasingly stressed about retrieving the money from Ashley, and that Ashley had been making excuses and delays for weeks before Taylor's disappearance. Phone records showed multiple attempts by Taylor to contact Ashley in the days leading up to September 8, suggesting persistent rather than patient communication about the money. As the investigation continued, more disturbing evidence came to light. A witness named Audrey Warren came forward with shocking information about conversations she had had with Ashley MacArthur in the weeks before Taylor's disappearance. According to Warren, Ashley had discussed killing Taylor in chilling detail, even considering methods like putting cocaine in Taylor's beer to make the death appear accidental. Warren testified that Ashley had said, she said she was going to put it, cocaine, in Taylor's beer. She said this world would be better if Taylor wasn't here and she wasn't a good person, once that she was too small to hurt anybody so she'd just shoot them. These statements, if accurate, demonstrated clear premeditation and a level of callousness that was difficult to comprehend from someone who claimed to be Taylor's friend. Armed with this evidence of financial motive and premeditated planning, investigators obtained search warrants for Ashley's home and other properties associated with her. What they found there provided the final pieces of the puzzle they needed to move forward with criminal charges. In Ashley's residence, investigators discovered Taylor's passport, something Taylor would never have left behind if she had disappeared voluntarily. They also found a firearm with one bullet missing from the chamber, providing potential evidence of the weapon used in Taylor's murder. The combination of financial records, witness testimony, and physical evidence painted a clear picture of Ashley MacArthur as the prime suspect in Taylor Wright's disappearance and presumed death. But having strong suspicions and solid evidence was not the same as having a body, and without Taylor's remains, prosecutors would face significant challenges in pursuing murder charges. The legal system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and defense attorneys are skilled at creating doubt when key evidence is missing. Recognizing this challenge, investigators focused their efforts on finding Taylor's body. They used cell phone data to map Ashley's movements on September 8 and the days immediately following, looking for locations where Ashley might have disposed of evidence. They brought in cadaver dogs to search properties associated with Ashley and conducted extensive ground searches in rural areas around Pensacola. The breakthrough came on October 9, 2017, just over a month after Taylor's disappearance. Acting on information developed through their investigation, detectives obtained a search warrant for a farm property in a remote area outside Pensacola. Within 2 hours of beginning their search, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains in a wooded area of the property. The discovery of what appeared to be a grave site was both a relief and a tragedy for everyone involved in the case. Investigators knew that finding Taylor's body would be crucial for prosecution, but it also meant confirming the worst fears of her family and friends. The woman who had rebuilt her life after a difficult divorce, who had found love with Cassandra, and who was looking forward to a fresh start, would never come home. The excavation of the grave site was conducted with meticulous care, as investigators knew that every piece of evidence could be crucial in the prosecution that would follow. Investigators began extracting the body and found a necklace that they had seen Taylor wearing in a photo. This jewelry would become one of the key pieces of evidence linking the remains to Taylor Wright and ultimately helping to secure justice for her murder. Lead prosecutor Bridget Jensen later recalled the moment when Taylor's distinctive necklace was uncovered. "My gut told me at that point that it was going to be Taylor," Jensen said, describing the emotional weight of that discovery. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly to find Taylor, seeing that necklace meant that their efforts had succeeded, but it also meant confronting the reality of what Ashley MacArthur had done to someone who had trusted her completely. Dental records would later confirm that the remains found at the farm were indeed those of Taylor Wright. The medical examiner determined that she had died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, a finding consistent with the missing bullet investigators had discovered during their search of Ashley's home. She had been shot in the back of the head. The manner of death confirmed investigators' suspicions about premeditation, as shooting someone in the back of the head suggests the victim was unaware of the impending attack. The discovery of Taylor's body also revealed the callousness with which Ashley had treated her friend's remains. She was found with a gunshot wound to the head and had been wrapped in a hammock. Rather than showing any respect for the person Taylor had been, Ashley had treated her body like trash to be hidden and forgotten. This detail would later prove significant during the trial, as it demonstrated Ashley's complete lack of remorse or humanity in her treatment of someone she had claimed to care about. With Taylor's body recovered and the cause of death established, prosecutors moved quickly to upgrade the charges against Ashley MacArthur. Upon her arrest, MacArthur was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. This charge reflects the most serious level of homicide under Florida law, reserved for cases where the prosecution can prove that the defendant planned and deliberated before committing the murder. The evidence supporting the premeditation charge was substantial. Witness testimony about Ashley's discussions of killing Taylor, the financial motive created by Ashley's theft of the money, and the calculated manner in which the murder was carried out all pointed to a crime that was planned rather than spontaneous. Ashley had not killed Taylor in a moment of panic or anger. She had made a deliberate decision to commit murder as a solution to her financial and legal problems. As Ashley awaited trial, more details about her background and character emerged that painted a disturbing picture of someone who had been living a double life. While presenting herself as a trustworthy friend and former law enforcement professional, Ashley had actually been engaging in various forms of fraud and theft for years before Taylor's murder. From 2015 to 2017, MacArthur was reportedly lining her pockets with stolen money. Court records revealed a pattern of financial crimes that extended well beyond her theft of Taylor's money. Ashley had been involved in insurance fraud, racketeering, and other schemes designed to enrich herself at the expense of others. The murder of Taylor Wright was not an isolated act of desperation, but rather the culmination of years of increasingly serious criminal behavior. This pattern of criminality provided important context for understanding how Ashley could have betrayed and murdered someone she called a friend. Rather than being a good person who made one terrible mistake, Ashley was revealed to be someone who had been systematically deceiving and stealing from others for years. Taylor's trust and friendship had been just another resource for Ashley to exploit, and when that exploitation was threatened with exposure, Ashley had chosen murder rather than accountability. The trial of Ashley MacArthur began in 2019, nearly 2 years after Taylor's murder. The prosecution, led by experienced prosecutors who specialized in complex homicide cases, methodically presented evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of Ashley's guilt. They established motive through the financial theft, opportunity through Ashley's confirmed presence with Taylor on the day of her disappearance, and means through the evidence of planning and the weapon found in Ashley's possession. One of the most powerful aspects of the prosecution's case was the testimony of Audrey Warren, who described Ashley's chilling statements about killing Taylor. This testimony provided crucial insight into Ashley's state of mind and her premeditated intent to commit murder. The jury heard how Ashley had coldly discussed methods of killing her friend, treating Taylor's life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The physical evidence was equally compelling. Taylor's passport found in Ashley's home, the firearm with the missing bullet, and the financial records showing Ashley's theft of the $34,000 all supported the prosecution's narrative. But perhaps most powerful of all was the distinctive necklace found with Taylor's remains, which provided an emotional connection between the victim and the evidence that jurors could understand and remember. The defense faced an almost impossible task in trying to create reasonable doubt about Ashley's guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, spanning financial records, witness testimony, physical evidence, and the discovery of Taylor's body. Ashley's attorneys attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that other explanations were possible, but they struggled to present a coherent alternative theory of what had happened to Taylor Wright. Throughout the trial, Ashley maintained her innocence, never acknowledging her role in Taylor's death or showing remorse for her actions. This lack of accountability was particularly painful for Taylor's family and friends, who had hoped that the trial process might provide some explanation or closure for their loss. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching their verdict. She went on trial in 2019, and she was ultimately found guilty. The conviction on charges of first-degree premeditated murder meant that Ashley MacArthur would face the most severe penalties available under Florida law. During the sentencing phase of the trial, Taylor's family and friends had the opportunity to speak about the impact of her murder on their lives. Cassandra Waller described the dreams they had shared and the future that had been stolen from them. Family members talked about Taylor's character, her dedication to justice in her professional life, and the way her absence had left a hole in their lives that could never be filled. The judge, considering the severity of the crime, the lack of remorse shown by the defendant, and the impact on the victim's family, imposed the maximum sentence possible. She is currently serving a life sentence in prison. This sentence ensures that Ashley MacArthur will never again have the opportunity to betray someone's trust or harm another person in the way she harmed Taylor Wright. The conviction and sentencing brought a measure of justice for Taylor Wright, but it could not undo the damage that Ashley MacArthur had caused. A promising life had been cut short by greed and betrayal, leaving behind a community of people who cared about Taylor and who continue to mourn her loss. In the years since Ashley's conviction, appeals courts have reviewed the case and upheld both the conviction and the life sentence. Appeals court upholds life sentence of Ashley MacArthur for murder of private investigator. These appeals provided Ashley with additional opportunities to challenge her conviction, but the evidence presented at trial was so strong that appellate courts found no grounds for overturning the jury's verdict. The case of Taylor Wright's murder serves as a stark reminder of how quickly trust can be betrayed and how devastating the consequences can be when someone chooses personal gain over human life. Taylor had extended friendship and financial trust to someone she believed shared her values and background, only to discover too late that Ashley MacArthur was capable of the ultimate betrayal. For those who knew Taylor, her murder represents not just the loss of an individual life, but the destruction of faith in human relationships and trust. The fact that Taylor was killed by someone she considered a close friend adds an additional layer of tragedy to an already devastating crime. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces and that even those who seem most trustworthy can harbor dark intentions. The investigation and prosecution of this case also demonstrated the dedication of law enforcement professionals who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims of violent crime. From the initial missing person investigation through the discovery of Taylor's remains and the successful prosecution of her killer, multiple agencies and individuals worked together to ensure that Ashley MacArthur would be held accountable for her actions. Today, Ashley MacArthur remains in prison, serving a life sentence for the premeditated murder of Taylor Wright. She has never expressed genuine remorse for her actions or provided a full account of what happened on September 8, 2017. The details of Taylor's final moments remain known only to her killer, who has chosen to take those secrets to prison rather than provide any closure to Taylor's loved ones. Meanwhile, Taylor Wright's memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. Cassandra Waller has spoken about the importance of remembering Taylor not just as a victim of a horrible crime, but as a complete person who had dreams, ambitions, and the capacity to love and be loved. Taylor's work as a private investigator reflected her commitment to uncovering truth and seeking justice, values that were honored through the investigation and prosecution of her own murder. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of being careful with both money and trust. While most people who ask friends to hold money or valuables are genuinely trustworthy, Taylor's story demonstrates the potentially devastating consequences when that trust is misplaced. Financial arrangements between friends, no matter how informal, can create complications and pressures that reveal hidden aspects of people's characters. As we reflect on this tragic story, it's important to remember that behind the legal proceedings and criminal evidence was a real person whose life mattered. Taylor Wright was a daughter, a partner, a friend, and a professional who was working to build a better life for herself after overcoming significant personal challenges. Her murder represents not just a crime against an individual, but a loss to the community and to all the people whose lives she might have touched in the years she was denied. The investigation, trial, and conviction of Ashley MacArthur demonstrate that justice is possible even in the most challenging cases. While nothing can bring Taylor Wright back or undo the pain caused by her murder, the legal system worked as it should to identify her killer and ensure that accountability was achieved. The life sentence imposed on Ashley MacArthur serves both as punishment for her crimes and as a message that the taking of innocent life will not be tolerated or go unpunished. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we reflect on stories like this one, we might consider the preciousness of the trust we extend to others and the responsibility we bear when others trust us. Taylor Wright's story reminds us that life can change in an instant, that trust once broken can have irreparable consequences, and that the choices we make about how to treat others define not just our character, but sometimes the very trajectory of multiple lives. The warm September day in Pensacola that began with Taylor's hopes for resolving her financial situation ended with her life being taken by someone she had trusted completely. In the years since, justice has been served, but the loss remains irreparable. Taylor Wright's story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, reminding us of the importance of choosing our confidence wisely and treating the trust of others as the precious gift it truly is. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll remember Taylor Wright not just as a victim, but as a person who lived, loved, worked, and dreamed, and whose memory deserves to be honored by the justice that was ultimately achieved in her name. In a world where betrayal and violence sometimes seem to overshadow human goodness, her story also reminds us of the dedicated professionals who work tirelessly to ensure that even when the worst happens, accountability and justice remain possible. The case is closed, the killer imprisoned, but Taylor Wright's legacy lives on in the memories of those who loved her and in the example of a life that, though cut short, was lived with purpose and hope for a better tomorrow. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Our story begins on a warm September evening in 1978, in a television studio in Los Angeles. The bright lights of The Dating Game illuminate three bachelors sitting behind a partition, each hoping to win a date with the beautiful bachelorette on the other side. Bachelor number 1 is charming, articulate, and handsome. His voice is smooth as silk as he answers the bachelorette's questions with wit and confidence. "What's your best time?" she asks. "The best time is at night, nighttime," he responds with a slight pause that seems almost predatory in hindsight. This is Rodney James Alcala, and by the time he sits in that studio chair, he has already murdered at least 5 people. The audience laughs at his answers, completely unaware that they're watching a serial killer perform on national television. But our story doesn't begin in that studio. It begins much earlier, with a boy named Rodrigo Jacques Alcala, born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. When Rodney was 8 years old, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise 3 children alone. The family moved to Los Angeles, where young Rodney would grow up, a seemingly normal boy who would later become one of California's most notorious serial killers. The transformation from troubled child to predator didn't happen overnight. Rodney James Alcala was an American serial killer and convicted sex offender who was sentenced to death in California for 5 murders committed between 1977 and 1979. But his crimes began much earlier than that. In 1968, when Alcala was 25 years old, he was working as a photographer in Los Angeles. Photography would become both his profession and his hunting method, a way to lure victims with promises of modeling opportunities and artistic portraits. On September 25, 1968, Alcala's true nature revealed itself for the first time in the most horrific way. 8-year-old Tali Shapiro was walking to school in West Hollywood when a stranger approached her in his car. The man was friendly, convincing. He told the little girl he was a photographer and asked if she'd like to see some pictures. Trusting and innocent, Tali got into the car with Rodney Alcala. What happened next was a nightmare that would haunt investigators for decades. Alcala drove Tali to his apartment on Fountain Avenue. There, in the privacy of his home, he brutally beat and sexually assaulted the child. He struck her head repeatedly with a steel bar, leaving her for dead. But fate intervened that day in the form of a good Samaritan. A witness had seen the little girl get into Alcala's car and had the presence of mind to note the license plate number. When they called police, officers rushed to Alcala's apartment. They found Tali unconscious, blood pooling around her small body, her skull fractured. Miraculously, she was still breathing. Alcala, however, was gone. By the time police arrived, he had fled, abandoning his apartment and disappearing into the vastness of America. After raping and almost killing Tali Shapiro, he fled to New York. This would be the first of many times Rodney Alcala would slip through the fingers of law enforcement. Tali Shapiro survived, though she would carry the physical and emotional scars of that attack for the rest of her life. She had no memory of what happened to her, perhaps her mind's way of protecting her from the trauma. Alcala's first known victim had escaped death, but she wouldn't be his last victim. He fled to New York and studied film at NYU under Roman Polanski. He made friends. He charmed people. He got into NYU Film School. This is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of Alcala's story, his ability to reinvent himself, to charm and manipulate even after committing the most heinous acts. In New York, Rodney Alcala became a different person. He was no longer the failed photographer who had brutally assaulted a child. He was now an aspiring filmmaker, a student at one of the most prestigious film schools in the country. He studied under Roman Polanski, the acclaimed director who would later face his own controversies. None of his fellow students suspected that their popular classmate had a double life. For 2 years, Alcala lived this double life. By day, he was the charming film student, discussing camera angles and lighting with his professors. By night, he walked the streets of Manhattan, and investigators now believe he was hunting. It was during this time that Alcala likely committed his first adult murder. New York Police Department investigators now believe that a week after returning to Manhattan, Alcala killed Ellen Jane Hover, 23-year-old daughter of nightclub owner Herman Hover and goddaughter of Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Hover was last seen at her New York apartment on July 15, 1977. Ellen Hover was not just any victim. She was connected to Hollywood royalty, the goddaughter of 2 of the most famous entertainers in America. She was young, beautiful, and full of life, exactly the type of victim that seemed to attract Alcala. Ellen disappeared without a trace from her Manhattan apartment. Her body wouldn't be found for decades. But Alcala's time in New York was running out. In 1971, he made a fatal mistake. He appeared on the FBI's most wanted list. His photograph was broadcast on television, and someone who knew him from his NYU days recognized him. The call came in to the FBI, and suddenly, Rodney Alcala's carefully constructed new identity crumbled. The FBI arrested Alcala, and he was extradited back to California to face charges for the assault on Tali Shapiro. But what happened next would prove to be a devastating failure of the justice system, one that would cost many more lives. The problem was simple: Tali Shapiro, now 13 years old, still had no memory of the attack. With no main witness, prosecutors had no choice but to offer Alcala a deal: plead guilty to a lesser charge of child molestation and register as a sex offender. Alcala took the deal. What happened next stunned everyone involved in the case. The judge sentenced Alcala to an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life in prison. It seemed like justice had been served, but the parole board had different ideas. After serving just 17 months, Rodney Alcala was released on parole. 17 months. For the brutal assault of an 8-year-old child. For beating her nearly to death with a steel bar. 17 months, and he was free to walk the streets again. The system had failed catastrophically, but the consequences of this failure wouldn't become apparent for several more years. Alcala was released in 1974, and he immediately returned to what he knew best: photography. He set up shop again in Los Angeles, advertising himself as a professional photographer, offering to take portraits of young women and children. But his freedom was short-lived. In 1974, just months after his release, Alcala was arrested again. This time, the victim was a 13-year-old girl. He had lured her to his car under the pretense of giving her a ride, then attempted to assault her. Fortunately, the girl managed to escape and report the incident to police. Once again, Alcala found himself in front of a judge. Once again, he was given a relatively light sentence, 2 years in prison. And once again, he served less than his full sentence, being released in 1977. By the time Rodney Alcala walked free in 1977, he had spent a total of less than 4 years in prison for 2 separate attacks on children. The system had given him multiple chances, and he was about to make them all pay dearly for their leniency. 1977 was a pivotal year for Rodney Alcala. Newly released from prison and now in his mid-30s, he was about to embark on the most violent period of his life. The failed attempts at rehabilitation, the light sentences, the early releases, all of these had only served to convince Alcala that he could get away with anything. Among the women whose DNA matched: Jill Barkham, whose body was found on a Los Angeles roadside in 1977 with her face mutilated and ligatures around her neck. Jill Barkham was just 18 years old when she crossed paths with Rodney Alcala. She had come to Los Angeles with dreams, like so many young women before her. Perhaps she was hoping to become an actress, or a model, or maybe she just wanted to experience life in the big city. Instead, she encountered a monster. Jill Barkham, who was killed in November 1977. Her body was found on a roadside in Los Angeles, but the condition of her remains told a story of unimaginable suffering. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Ligature marks around her neck indicated she had been strangled. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. But Jill Barkham was just the beginning. Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse whose body was found naked and brutalized in her Malibu, California, home in 1977. Georgia Wickstead had dedicated her life to helping others. As a nurse, she had chosen a profession built on compassion and care. She had no way of knowing that her kindness would be exploited by a predator. Alcala somehow gained access to her Malibu home, and what he did there defied comprehension. Georgia Wickstead, who was raped, beaten, and strangled in December 1978. The crime scene was so brutal that investigators initially struggled to determine if they were looking at a murder or something even worse. Georgia's body bore signs of prolonged torture. She had been beaten with such force that her skull was fractured. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The pattern was becoming clear. Alcala wasn't just killing, he was torturing his victims. He was taking his time, inflicting maximum pain and suffering before finally ending their lives. The brutality was escalating with each attack. By 1978, Rodney Alcala had perfected his facade. To the outside world, he appeared to be a successful photographer with an easy charm and good looks. When Rodney Alcala went on the dating game in 1978, he'd already brutally murdered at least 4 women. But somehow, he had managed to convince the producers of The Dating Game that he would make good television. The irony is almost too perfect. Here was America's most popular dating show, designed to bring together compatible singles, and they had unknowingly cast a serial killer as one of their bachelors. Alcala won the September 13, 1978 episode, though no one was aware that, by then, he'd already killed Crilly, Hover, Barkham, Wixted, and Lamb. The show aired exactly as planned. Bachelor number 1, Rodney Alcala, charmed both the Bachelorette and the studio audience with his witty responses and confident demeanor. When asked about his hobbies, he mentioned photography, of course. When asked about his ideal date, his answers had an unsettling undertone that no one picked up on at the time. Cheryl Bradshaw, the woman who chose Alcala, called the dating game's contestant coordinator Ellen Metzger the next day to say she'd changed her mind about the date. Something about Alcala had made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was something in his voice, or the way he looked at her, or perhaps just an instinctive feeling that something wasn't right. Whatever it was, that instinct likely saved her life. Years later, when Alcala's true identity was revealed, Cheryl Bradshaw would realize just how close she had come to becoming another victim. She had literally chosen a serial killer on national television, then had the good sense to trust her instincts and avoid being alone with him. But while Cheryl Bradshaw's intuition saved her, others weren't so fortunate. 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb, who was murdered in June 1978. Charlotte Lamb was killed just months before Alcala appeared on The Dating Game. Charlotte Lamb, whose body was found naked and brutalized. The pattern continued. The same signature brutality, the same signs of prolonged torture and sexual assault. Charlotte Lamb, like the others, had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when she encountered Rodney Alcala. Throughout the 70s, Alcala photographed over 100 women and children, several of whom are speculated by investigators to be unidentified victims he killed after the photo shoots. This was perhaps Alcala's most diabolical method of hunting for victims. Photography provided the perfect cover. Alcala could approach young women on beaches, in parks, on college campuses, and offer to take their pictures. He had professional equipment, he dressed well, and he had a smooth, convincing manner. To his potential victims, he must have seemed like a legitimate photographer offering them a chance at modeling or simply a free portrait session. But the reality was far more sinister. Alcala wasn't interested in creating art, he was creating a catalog of potential victims. The hundreds of photographs he took served multiple purposes. They allowed him to spend time alone with young women, studying them, learning their habits, deciding who would become his next target. They also served as trophies, mementos of his encounters that he could revisit later. Many of these photographs would later be released by police in hopes of identifying potential victims. The images are haunting, young women and children smiling innocently at the camera, having no idea they were being photographed by a killer. Some of these people in the photographs have never been identified. They remain Jane and John Doe's, faces frozen in time, their fates unknown. The photography also revealed another disturbing aspect of Alcala's personality, his narcissism. He didn't just photograph his victims, he photographed himself. Dozens of self-portraits showed him posing, preening, admiring his own reflection. This wasn't just about documenting his crimes, it was about feeding his ego, reinforcing his belief that he was superior to everyone around him. 21-year-old Jill Parento, who was killed in June 1979. By 1979, Alcala's killing spree was reaching its peak. Jill Parento was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Like the others, she became a victim of Alcala's escalating violence. But it was his next victim that would finally bring Alcala's reign of terror to an end. He was charged with murder for the first time in 1979 for the death of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe, who disappeared in June that year on her way to a ballet studio. Robin Samsoe was just 12 years old, a child with bright eyes and a love of dance. On June 20, 1979, she and a friend were riding their bicycles to Huntington Beach when they encountered a stranger with a camera. The man said he was a photographer and asked if he could take their pictures. The friend became uncomfortable and left, but Robin stayed behind. It was the last time anyone would see Robin Samsoe alive. Her remains were found nearly 2 weeks later in the San Gabriel Mountains. The discovery of Robin's body launched one of the largest missing persons investigations in Orange County history. Unlike the previous victims, Robin's disappearance had been witnessed. Her friend was able to provide a description of the photographer, and that description led investigators to a sketch that would eventually help identify Rodney Alcala. But the case was about more than just finding Robin's killer. Detective Chris Camacho, who worked the case, understood that this wasn't an isolated incident. The brutality, the method, the type of victim, it all suggested they were dealing with a serial killer. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Alcala's crimes and bring justice not just for Robin Samsoe, but for all of his victims. The search for Robin Samsoe's killer was methodical and relentless. Investigators canvassed the beach where she had last been seen, interviewed hundreds of people, and followed up on thousands of tips. The breakthrough came when they released the composite sketch based on the description provided by Robin's friend. The sketch looked like Rodney Alcala. When police ran Alcala's name through their system, they discovered his history of child molestation and assault. They learned about his previous arrests, his time in New York, and his pattern of using photography to approach potential victims. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The arrest came in July 1979, just a few weeks after Robin's body was found. Police located Alcala at his mother's house in Monterey Park, and what they found there provided chilling evidence of his crimes. In addition to photography equipment and hundreds of photographs of unidentified women and children, they found jewelry that would later be linked to several of his victims. Among the items was a pair of gold ball earrings that belonged to Robin Samsoe. They also found jewelry belonging to other victims, kept as trophies of his crimes. Each piece represented a life taken, a family destroyed, a future stolen. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Alcala's demeanor during the arrest. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. To him, his victims were nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. He treated an earring with more respect than a human being, one investigator later observed. Alcala was sentenced to death in Orange County in 1980 for the 1979 kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe. That judgment was reversed in 1984 by the California Supreme Court and Alcala was granted a new trial. The first trial was a media sensation. Here was the handsome photographer who had appeared on The Dating Game, revealed to be a child killer. The evidence against him was overwhelming: witness testimony, physical evidence, and the jewelry found in his possession. The jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. But the legal system wasn't finished with Rodney Alcala. In 1986, Alcala was sentenced to death a second time for Samsoe's murder. The California Supreme Court had overturned his first conviction on a technicality, forcing prosecutors to retry the case. Once again, Alcala was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, the second conviction was also overturned, this time by a federal appeals court. The legal wrangling continued for decades, with appeals and retrials that frustrated investigators and devastated the families of victims. It wasn't until 2010 that Alcala faced his final trial. By this time, advances in DNA technology had linked him to additional murders. Alcala, 67, was convicted last year of strangling 4 women and a 12-year-old girl in California in the 1970s, in killings prosecutors said were laced with sexual abuse and torture. The final trial was different from the previous ones. This time, prosecutors were able to present evidence linking Alcala to multiple murders across different jurisdictions. The DNA evidence was ironclad. The pattern of violence was undeniable. After more than 30 years, justice was finally served. Serial killer Rodney Alcala murdered at least 8 women and girls and sexually assaulted at least 2 girls across the United States in the 1970s, though his true death toll could number more than 100. Some have estimated the number of his victims to be as high as 130. Those numbers are staggering, but they may not even represent the full truth. There are still over 100 photographs of unidentified women who may have been his victims. Each photograph represents a potential victim, a person whose fate remains unknown. The photographs were released by law enforcement in multiple states, hoping to identify potential victims and provide closure to families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. Some of the people in the photographs came forward to say they were still alive. They had simply been photographed by Alcala and managed to escape becoming victims. Others were identified by family members who recognized their missing loved ones. But many remain unidentified to this day. Young women and children stare out from these photographs, frozen in time, their stories untold. They represent the true tragedy of Alcala's crimes, not just the lives he took, but the families left wondering, the cases left unsolved, the justice denied. Investigators believe Alcala operated in multiple states over a period of more than a decade. The New York charges open a new chapter in the convoluted, sometimes bizarre bicoastal saga. He was eventually charged with murders in New York as well, including the death of Ellen Hover, the nightclub owner's daughter whose disappearance had gone unsolved for decades. What creates a monster like Rodney Alcala? Psychologists and criminologists have studied his case extensively, trying to understand the factors that transformed a seemingly ordinary man into one of America's most prolific serial killers. Several factors emerge from his background. The abandonment by his father when he was 8 years old may have created deep-seated issues with authority and relationships. His ability to compartmentalize his life, to function normally in social situations while harboring violent fantasies, suggests a profound disconnection from normal human empathy. His use of photography as both a cover and a method of victim selection shows a calculating intelligence. This wasn't a killer who acted impulsively, he was methodical, patient, and strategic in his approach. He understood how to manipulate people's trust, how to appear harmless and even charming when necessary. Perhaps most disturbing was his apparent enjoyment of the hunt. The photographs suggest that he derived pleasure not just from the violence itself, but from the process of selecting and stalking his victims. The trophies he kept, the jewelry, the photographs, indicate that he wanted to relive his crimes, to maintain some connection to his victims even after their deaths. When we're talking about a serial killer, we're talking about someone who has developed a very specific fantasy, explained one criminal psychologist. For Alcala, that fantasy involved complete control over another human being, the power of life and death, the ability to inflict pain and terror at will. In all the focus on Alcala's crimes and psychology, it's important to remember that his story is ultimately about the lives he destroyed. Each of his victims was a real person with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were cut short by his violence. Tali Shapiro, the 8-year-old who survived his first known attack, grew up to become an advocate for child safety. Despite having no memory of the assault, she has spoken publicly about the importance of trusting instincts and teaching children to recognize dangerous situations. Jill Barkham was remembered by her family as a vibrant young woman who loved life and had big dreams for her future. Georgia Wickstead was a dedicated nurse whose colleagues described her as someone who truly cared about helping others. Charlotte Lamb was a free spirit who loved adventure and wasn't afraid to take chances, a quality that may have made her vulnerable to Alcala's approach. Jill Parento was just starting her adult life when she was killed. She had recently moved to Los Angeles and was working to establish her independence. Ellen Hover, the goddaughter of Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., was described as kind and trusting, qualities that made her an easy target for someone like Alcala. And Robin Samsoe, the 12-year-old whose murder finally brought Alcala to justice, was remembered as a bright child who loved ballet and had dreams of becoming a professional dancer. Her death galvanized the investigation that would eventually reveal the full scope of Alcala's crimes. These weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were daughters, sisters, friends, real people whose lives mattered, whose deaths left lasting holes in the hearts of those who loved them. The legal battles surrounding Alcala's case highlight the complexities and frustrations of the American justice system. His first conviction was overturned on technical grounds. His second conviction was also reversed. It took more than 30 years from the time of Robin Samso's murder to reach a final resolution. During those decades, Alcala sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal, consuming resources and preventing closure for the families of his victims. The system that had failed to protect his victims by releasing him too early from his initial sentences continued to fail them by allowing him to manipulate the appeals process. But advances in forensic science eventually made his guilt undeniable. DNA evidence linked him definitively to multiple murders. Cold cases that had gone unsolved for decades were suddenly resolved. The technology that didn't exist when he committed his crimes ultimately became the key to achieving justice. In 2010, at the age of 67, Rodney Alcala was finally convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Additional charges in other states followed. The legal system had finally caught up with him, though it had taken far longer than anyone had hoped. Rodney James Alcala died on July 24, 2021, in a hospital near the California prison where he had been held on death row. He was 77 years old and had been battling various health issues for several years. His death came not from the execution chamber, but from natural causes, a final frustration for those who had waited decades to see justice fully served. The man who had terrorized California and New York in the 1970s, who had appeared on national television while secretly being a serial killer, who had manipulated the legal system for decades with appeals and retrials, died quietly in a prison hospital bed. There was no fanfare, no final statement, no acknowledgement of his crimes or expression of remorse. His death brought a sense of closure to some of the families of his victims, though for many, the wounds he had inflicted would never fully heal. The photographs of unidentified potential victims remained a haunting reminder that the full scope of his crimes might never be known. In the end, Rodney Alcala's legacy is one of terror, manipulation, and the failure of systems designed to protect innocent people. But it's also a testament to the persistence of investigators who never gave up, the advancement of forensic science that made justice possible, and the resilience of families who endured decades of uncertainty and pain while waiting for answers. The story of the dating game killer serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that charm and intelligence can mask the darkest intentions, and that the price of failing to recognize these warning signs can be measured in human lives. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember not just the darkness of this story, but also the light, the investigators who never stopped seeking justice, the families who never stopped loving their lost ones, and the survivors who found the strength to rebuild their lives. In the face of unimaginable evil, they proved that human goodness and determination can ultimately prevail. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey into the quiet forests of Oregon, where the winter air carried secrets through towering pines and mist-covered hills. This is the story of Allison Joy Watterson, a young woman whose disappearance would unravel like morning fog, revealing inconsistencies, unanswered questions, and a mystery that continues to echo through the Pacific Northwest. So let me take you back to December 2019, when Christmas lights twinkled in windows across North Plains, Oregon, and families prepared for the holidays. But for one family, the season would forever be marked not by celebration, but by an absence that would haunt them for months to come. Allison Joy Watterson was 20 years old when this story begins. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall with a slender frame of about 120 pounds, she moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone still discovering who she was meant to become. Those who knew her would later describe a young woman with expressive eyes and an artistic spirit, evidenced by the tattoos she had chosen to mark her skin. An eye adorned her left front shoulder, watching the world with eternal vigilance, while a delicate fairy perched on a spider's web decorated her left forearm, a blend of whimsy and darkness that perhaps reflected the complexities of her young life. The Pacific Northwest had always been home to Allison. The region's moody skies and evergreen landscapes provided a backdrop to her daily existence, where rain fell in gentle symphonies and morning mist transformed familiar places into something almost magical. Like many young people in Oregon, she was accustomed to the rhythm of seasons marked not by snow and heat, but by the varying intensities of rain and the way light filtered differently through the trees throughout the year. In December 2019, Allison was navigating the particular challenges that come with being 20 in America, that awkward space between adolescence and true adulthood, where independence feels both exhilarating and terrifying. She was building relationships, making decisions about her future, and learning to trust her instincts about the people who entered her orbit. Among these people was Benjamin Hunter Garland, 21 years old and the person who would become the central figure in what happened next. Their relationship was the kind that blooms in early adulthood, intense and consuming, filled with the certainty that only young love can provide. Benjamin, just a year older than Allison, seemed to understand her in ways that perhaps others did not. They were often together, creating the shared world that couples build when they're discovering what it means to be truly close to another person. But as we'll discover, relationships at that age can be complicated by things we don't yet understand about ourselves or others. The person who seems to love you most can sometimes be the one who poses the greatest danger, though this truth often remains hidden until it's too late to change course. Friday, December 20, 2019, began like any other winter day in Oregon. The sky hung low and gray, promising the kind of persistent drizzle that locals barely notice anymore. For Allison's family, this Friday held no particular significance. It was simply another day in the lead-up to Christmas, filled with the ordinary tasks and conversations that weave together the fabric of our lives. But this Friday would later become precious to them, crystallized in memory as the last time they heard Allison's voice. The last time her family had contact with their daughter, sister, and loved one was on this unremarkable December morning. The conversation was probably routine, perhaps discussions about Christmas plans, maybe casual updates about work or friends. The kind of exchange that seems insignificant in the moment but becomes weighted with unbearable poignancy when you realize it was the final one. No one who spoke with Allison that Friday could have imagined they were saying goodbye. The human mind isn't designed to recognize last moments as they happen. We assume there will always be another conversation, another opportunity to say the things we mean to say. It's only in retrospect that ordinary moments transform into something sacred and heartbreaking. After that Friday morning, silence. Not the comfortable silence of someone busy with their own life, but the kind of quiet that gradually becomes noticeable, then concerning, then frightening. Family members might have initially assumed she was caught up in her relationship with Benjamin, or perhaps dealing with the normal stresses of young adulthood. But as hours turned to days, the silence began to feel different. Weekend plans came and went without word from Allison. Saturday passed, then Sunday morning, then Sunday afternoon. The space where her voice should have been grew larger and more ominous with each passing hour. Sunday, December 22, 2019, dawned cold and overcast in North Plains, Oregon, a small community about 18 miles northwest of Portland. This rural area is characterized by rolling hills, scattered houses, and winding roads that snake through forests and farmland. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where unusual activities are noticed, and where the presence of strangers is remarked upon. According to the story that would later be told to police, Allison and Benjamin had planned a hiking adventure for this Sunday. The Oregon wilderness offers countless opportunities for outdoor enthusiasts, with trails that wind through old-growth forests, across streams, and up hillsides that provide panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. For young couples, hiking together can be an intimate way to spend time, away from the distractions of daily life, connected to each other and to the natural world around them. Benjamin would later claim that he and Allison drove out to the area near Old Pumpkin Ridge Road, a location that locals know for its scenic beauty and relative isolation. The road winds through forested areas where the canopy can block out most of the sky, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere even in daylight hours. During winter, these woods take on a different character. Branches bare of leaves create intricate patterns against the gray sky, and the forest floor becomes a carpet of wet leaves and fallen logs that muffle sound and create an almost otherworldly quiet. It was in this setting, according to Benjamin's account, that the couple set out for their hike around midday. The temperature was cold enough to require layers, the kind of weather where you might start hiking feeling chilly but warm up quickly once you're moving. Allison was dressed practically for the outdoors, wearing a mustard yellow hoodie that would have stood out against the muted tones of the winter forest, along with black pants and a maroon backpack that likely contained water, snacks, and other hiking essentials. But as they would soon discover, not everything about this Sunday was as simple as a young couple heading out for a day in nature. Witnesses would place them in the area, but the story of what happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny and investigation. Just before noon on that December 22nd, a homeowner living in the area near Old Pumpkin Ridge Road noticed something that would later become crucial to the investigation. From their property, they observed two young people walking along the road, a young woman in bright yellow and a young man beside her. The mustard-colored hoodie was distinctive enough that the witness would remember it clearly when questioned later. This sighting became the last confirmed observation of Allison Watterson alive. The homeowner had no way of knowing they were witnessing the final chapter of a young woman's life, but their memory would provide investigators with a crucial timestamp and location. Sometimes the most important moments in criminal cases hang on such brief observations: a neighbor glancing out a window, someone working in their yard who happens to notice strangers passing by. What makes this sighting particularly significant is its normalcy. The witness didn't report anything alarming about what they saw. Allison and Benjamin appeared to be simply two young people walking together, perhaps at the beginning of their planned hiking adventure. There was no indication of distress, no signs of conflict, no reason for concern. They were just another couple exploring the Oregon countryside on a winter Sunday. But within hours, this peaceful image would shatter completely. Monday, December 23rd, brought a completely different kind of scene to the quiet neighborhood near Old Pumpkin Ridge Road. As the sun struggled through the persistent Oregon clouds, a different homeowner in the area made a discovery that would immediately transform this from a story about a hiking adventure into something much more sinister. This homeowner awakened to find a young man on their property, soaked to the skin, disheveled, and in obvious distress. It was Benjamin Garland, but he bore little resemblance to the person who had been seen walking calmly with Allison just over 12 hours earlier. Now he appeared as someone who had spent a traumatic night outdoors in December weather, his clothes waterlogged, his demeanor shaken. The transformation was stark enough to alarm the homeowner. This wasn't a casual hiker who had simply gotten a bit wet from morning dew or light rain. Benjamin looked like someone who had been through an ordeal, the kind of exposure to elements that leaves a person genuinely hypothermic and disoriented. His appearance told a story of hours spent in conditions that were not just uncomfortable but potentially dangerous. What Benjamin told this Good Samaritan homeowner would become the foundation of the official story for what happened to Allison Watterson. According to his account, he and Allison had indeed been hiking the day before when they became separated in the wooded area. He claimed that he had spent the entire night searching for her, calling her name through the darkness, trying to find his way back to where they had parted ways. It was a story that had elements of plausibility. The Oregon wilderness can be genuinely disorienting, especially for people unfamiliar with the area. Trails that seem clear in daylight can become confusing as shadows lengthen, and what starts as a simple day hike can turn into a serious survival situation if people become lost or separated. The weather on December 22 had been cold, and spending a night outdoors without proper gear could easily explain Benjamin's bedraggled condition. But even from these early moments, there were aspects of the story that would raise questions in the minds of investigators. Here's where the timeline takes on a troubling quality that would haunt the investigation from the beginning. Despite Benjamin's claim that he had spent Sunday night desperately searching for his missing girlfriend, and despite his obvious distress when found by the homeowner on Monday morning, Allison Watterson was not reported missing until Tuesday, December 24, Christmas Eve. This delay is significant for several reasons. When someone you love goes missing in potentially dangerous circumstances, the natural human response is to call for help immediately. The first few hours after a disappearance are often considered the most critical for search and rescue operations. In wilderness settings especially, time can mean the difference between life and death for someone who is lost, injured, or exposed to the elements. 30 hours. That's how long elapsed between the last confirmed sighting of Allison and the official missing person report. 30 hours during which she could have been alive, possibly injured but survivable, waiting for rescue that wasn't coming because no one was officially looking for her yet. The delay becomes even more puzzling when you consider Benjamin's reported condition when found Monday morning. If he was genuinely that distressed, that affected by a night spent searching for Allison, why didn't he immediately contact authorities? Why didn't the homeowner who found him encourage him to call police right away? What happened during those crucial first 30 hours that kept this from becoming an active search and rescue operation? Different versions of events would emerge to explain this delay. Some accounts suggested that Benjamin initially hoped Allison might have found her own way back to civilization, perhaps seeking help from other sources. Other explanations centered around miscommunication or confusion about what had actually happened. But as investigators dug deeper, they would find that the delay wasn't the only troubling aspect of the timeline. When the missing person report was finally filed on Christmas Eve, the Washington County Sheriff's Office immediately recognized the urgency of the situation. A 20-year-old woman missing in the Oregon wilderness during winter weather conditions represented exactly the kind of emergency that requires immediate, intensive response. Search and rescue teams were mobilized quickly, bringing together the specialized skills needed for wilderness recovery operations. These teams included experienced trackers, K-9 units trained to follow human scent, volunteers familiar with the local terrain, and coordinators who could manage the complex logistics of searching thousands of acres of forested land. The area around Old Pumpkin Ridge Road presented particular challenges for searchers. The terrain includes dense forest sections where visibility is limited to just a few yards in any direction, steep hillsides where someone could easily fall and become trapped, and numerous small ravines and gullies where a person could be hidden from view. Winter conditions made everything more difficult. Wet leaves concealed footprints, cold temperatures limited how long search teams could remain effective, and the early darkness of December days shortened each search window. Benjamin Garland was, naturally, a crucial part of these early search efforts. As the last person to see Allison, and as someone who claimed familiarity with the area where they had been hiking, his cooperation was essential. He participated in interviews with investigators, attempting to retrace the route he and Allison had taken, identifying the location where he claimed they had become separated. But as the search progressed, investigators began to notice inconsistencies in Benjamin's accounts. Details that should have remained constant shifted from one telling to another. Locations that he identified as significant seemed to change. The story of how exactly he and Allison had become separated became less clear with each retelling rather than more precise. Professional search and rescue personnel are trained to work with witnesses and survivors who may be traumatized or confused by their experiences. They understand that memory can be unreliable under stress, that people genuinely trying to help may unconsciously alter details. But they're also trained to recognize when inconsistencies might indicate something more troubling than simple confusion or trauma. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the search for Allison Watterson evolved from an active rescue operation into a criminal investigation. This transformation happens gradually in missing person cases, as the hope of finding someone alive diminishes and investigators begin to consider less optimistic scenarios. The shift in approach brought different kinds of expertise to bear on Allison's case. Where search and rescue teams had been focused on covering ground and following potential trails, detectives now began examining the evidence with an eye toward understanding not just where Allison might be, but what might have happened to her. This more intensive investigation revealed details that cast serious doubt on the hiking story that had been the foundation of the search efforts. Most significantly, investigators announced that they could find no evidence to support the claim that Allison and Benjamin had actually been hiking together when she disappeared. This revelation was stunning to both the family and the community that had been following the case. If they weren't hiking, then what were they doing in that remote area? Why had Benjamin told a story about becoming separated on trails if there was no evidence they had been on trails at all? What had actually happened during those crucial hours on December 22nd? The lack of evidence for the hiking story didn't just create new questions, it called into doubt everything about the official account of Allison's disappearance. If Benjamin had lied about how she went missing, what else might he have been lying about? As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Benjamin Garland had legal troubles that went beyond his connection to Allison's disappearance. In the months following her vanishing, he was arrested on several charges that were described as unrelated to the missing person case but that painted a picture of someone whose life was more complicated than it might initially have appeared. The charges against Benjamin Garland were serious enough to result in significant prison time. He pleaded guilty to unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, fraudulent use of a credit card, and theft. These weren't minor infractions or mistakes in judgment, they represented a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned the period from October through December 2019. This timeline was significant because it meant Benjamin was actively engaged in criminal activities during the same period when he was dating Allison. The crimes occurred in the weeks and months leading up to her disappearance, suggesting that his life in late 2019 was much more chaotic and unstable than his girlfriend may have realized. The fraudulent use of credit cards and theft charges indicated financial desperation or simply a willingness to take what belonged to others. The unauthorized use of a motor vehicle suggested someone comfortable with more serious criminal behavior. Taking someone's car represents both theft and a violation of their personal security in ways that can be genuinely frightening for victims. When Benjamin was sentenced to 36 months in prison for these crimes, it effectively removed him from the active investigation into Allison's disappearance. He would serve his time unable to participate in searches, unavailable for questioning except under controlled circumstances, and isolated from the community that continued to seek answers about what had happened to the young woman he claimed to love. But even from prison, Benjamin's story continued to evolve in ways that troubled investigators. Law enforcement officials made it clear that while he was the last person known to have seen Allison alive, they had no direct evidence connecting him to whatever had happened to her. This careful language reflected both the reality of the evidence they had gathered and their frustration with the many unanswered questions that surrounded the case. The distinction was important. Being the last person to see someone alive doesn't automatically make someone a suspect in their disappearance. But it does make that person a crucial witness, and when that witness's story contains inconsistencies and apparent lies, it naturally focuses investigative attention in ways that can be very uncomfortable for the person involved. While investigators worked to piece together the truth about Allison's disappearance, her family faced a different kind of torment, the daily reality of not knowing what had happened to someone they loved. Missing person cases are particularly cruel to families because they exist in a liminal space between hope and grief, unable to move forward but unable to go back. Allison's relatives organized their own search parties, refusing to accept that professional efforts had exhausted all possibilities. These private searches brought together friends, extended family members, and community volunteers who were willing to spend their weekends walking through Oregon forests, calling Allison's name, and checking areas that might have been missed during official operations. The dedication required for this kind of searching is difficult for people to understand unless they've experienced it. Walking through dense forest for hours, knowing that you're looking for someone who may not be alive to respond if you call their name, represents a particular kind of emotional endurance. But families often find that the act of searching provides some sense of agency in situations where they otherwise feel completely powerless. Allison's aunt, Billie Macy, became one of the most visible advocates for continuing the search efforts. She organized volunteers, coordinated with property owners to gain access to private land, and kept the case in public awareness through media contacts and social media campaigns. Her commitment reflected the family's refusal to accept that Allison had simply vanished without trace. These family-led efforts covered extensive areas around North Plains, including properties that hadn't been included in the official search grid. Volunteers walked through private farms, checked out buildings and abandoned structures, and explored areas that were accessible only to people with permission from landowners. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but it represented the only way the family could feel they were still actively trying to bring Allison home. As months passed, the searches took on a different character. Where they had initially been driven by hope of finding Allison alive, they gradually became focused on the more sobering goal of finding her remains so that the family could have answers and closure. Saturday, June 20, 2020, began like any other day for the property owner who lived on Corey Road in North Plains. The spring weather was mild, perfect for working outdoors on projects that had been postponed during Oregon's long, wet winter months. The property, located in the 15800 block of Corey Road, was in the same general area where Allison had disappeared 6 months earlier, but it hadn't been included in the intensive searches that had covered much of the surrounding region. What the property owner discovered that Saturday morning would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Allison's family and investigators for months. Human remains, partially concealed and weathered by exposure to the elements through an entire Oregon winter, were found on the property. The location was significant for several reasons. It was close enough to the area where Allison had last been seen to be plausible as connected to her disappearance, but far enough from the main search zones to explain why she hadn't been found earlier. The remains were on private property that would have required specific permission to search, which may have delayed their discovery. For investigators, the discovery represented both relief and renewed urgency. Relief because it meant the uncertainty that had characterized the case could potentially be resolved with scientific evidence. Urgency because they now had a crime scene to process and physical evidence that might reveal what had actually happened to Allison. The Washington County Medical Examiner was brought in to handle the delicate process of recovery and identification. This work requires specialized expertise to ensure that evidence is preserved properly and that the remains are treated with the dignity they deserve. The identification process would involve multiple forms of analysis, including comparison with dental records and other identifying characteristics. On Friday, June 26, 2020, the official confirmation came. The remains were positively identified as those of Allison Joy Watterson, the 20-year-old woman who had vanished 6 months earlier on a winter day that now seemed very long ago. While the identification of Allison's remains provided her family with the terrible certainty they had been both dreading and needing, it also raised new questions about what had actually happened to her. The location where she was found was significant not just for its proximity to where she had disappeared, but for what it might reveal about the circumstances of her death. The medical examiner's office faced the challenging task of determining cause of death from remains that had been exposed to Oregon weather for 6 months. Winter rains, freezing temperatures, and the natural processes of decomposition can eliminate or obscure evidence that might otherwise be available to forensic investigators. This doesn't make determination impossible, but it does make it more difficult and sometimes less definitive than families and communities hope for. No final cause of death was immediately announced, reflecting the complexity of the forensic analysis required. This is often frustrating for people following such cases, but it's also necessary to ensure that any conclusions reached are based on solid scientific evidence rather than speculation or assumption. The location of the discovery also raised questions about the searches that had been conducted during the months following Allison's disappearance. Billie Macy, Allison's aunt who had been so instrumental in organizing family search efforts, expressed surprise that they had missed the property where Allison was ultimately found. This feeling is common in cases where remains are discovered relatively close to where extensive searches had been conducted. But missing person searches, even intensive ones involving professional teams and dedicated volunteers, cannot cover every possible location. Private property presents particular challenges because access requires permission from landowners, and some areas may be geographically difficult to search effectively. Weather conditions, vegetation, and the simple vastness of the potential search area all contribute to the reality that even the most dedicated efforts cannot guarantee that every square foot of relevant terrain will be examined. The discovery also refocused attention on Benjamin Garland and his role in whatever had happened to Allison. While he remained in prison serving his sentence for the unrelated charges, the finding of her remains meant that investigators could now approach the case with physical evidence to guide their inquiry. Even with the discovery and identification of Allison's remains, the investigation into her death remained active and ongoing. The Washington County Sheriff's Office made it clear that finding her body had answered some questions but created others that would require continued investigative work. The fact that no final cause of death had been determined meant that crucial questions about what had happened to Allison remained unanswered. Had she died of exposure while lost in the wilderness? Had she been the victim of foul play? Had her death been accidental or intentional? These questions couldn't be answered definitively until forensic analysis was complete. For the family, having Allison's remains meant they could finally lay her to rest with the dignity and ceremony she deserved. But it didn't provide the complete closure they had hoped for. Without understanding how and why she had died, they were left to continue wondering about the final hours of her life and whether someone had been responsible for ending it. The case remained officially open, meaning that investigators continued to follow leads, interview witnesses, and analyze evidence. This ongoing status also meant that if new information came to light, perhaps from someone who had previously been reluctant to speak with authorities, it could still potentially change the direction of the investigation. Benjamin Garland's status as the last person to see Allison alive continued to make him a person of interest, though authorities maintained their position that they had no direct evidence linking him to her death. This careful distinction reflected the legal reality that suspicion and evidence are different things, and that criminal charges require proof that meets specific legal standards. The complexity of the case was also reflected in the way authorities discussed it publicly. They were clearly frustrated by aspects of the investigation that remained unclear, but they were also careful not to make statements that might compromise potential future legal proceedings or unfairly implicate individuals who had not been charged with crimes. As the investigation into Allison Watterson's death continued, it raised broader questions about domestic relationships, personal safety, and the way missing person cases are investigated and understood by the public. One of the most troubling aspects of Allison's case was the way it highlighted how difficult it can be to recognize dangerous situations in intimate relationships. If Benjamin had been involved in her death, it would represent the kind of domestic violence that often remains hidden from friends and family members until it's too late to intervene. Young women are statistically at higher risk for violence from intimate partners than from strangers, but this reality is often obscured by cultural narratives that focus on stranger danger, rather than the more common threats that come from people we know and trust. Allison's case, regardless of its ultimate resolution, serves as a reminder that the people closest to us sometimes pose the greatest risks to our safety. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by families when someone they love goes missing. The delay in reporting Allison's disappearance, the inconsistencies in witness accounts, and the months of uncertainty all reflect the complex dynamics that can surround missing person investigations. Families often find themselves navigating not just their own grief and fear, but also law enforcement procedures, media attention, and community speculation. For the North Plains community, Allison's case became a reminder of how violence can intrude into even the most peaceful settings. The rural area where she disappeared was exactly the kind of place where people move to escape urban crime and feel secure raising their families. The realization that a young woman could vanish and die under mysterious circumstances in their own backyard was deeply unsettling for residents. The case also raised questions about hiking safety and the wisdom of venturing into remote areas without proper precautions. Even if the hiking story had been accurate, it would have represented poor judgment to head into wilderness areas during winter weather without adequate preparation or communication with others about planned routes and return times. As we reach the end of Allison's story, it's important to acknowledge what remains unknown. Despite months of investigation, extensive searches, and the recovery of her remains, crucial questions about her death have never been definitively answered. The case remains officially open, which means that investigators still hope additional evidence or information might provide clarity about what happened to her. This could come from forensic analysis that yields new insights, from witnesses who decide to come forward with information they previously withheld, or from other developments that sometimes occur years after the fact in criminal cases. For Allison's family, this ongoing uncertainty represents a particular kind of pain. They have been able to lay her to rest, but they continue to live with questions about whether someone was responsible for her death and, if so, whether that person will ever be held accountable. The community of North Plains, too, remains affected by the unresolved nature of the case. When violent crimes go unsolved, they leave communities feeling vulnerable and unsettled, uncertain whether the threat that claimed one life might still pose risks to others. Benjamin Garland completed his prison sentence for the unrelated charges and was released, but his role in Allison's story continues to be scrutinized by both law enforcement and the public. The inconsistencies in his account of what happened on December 22, 2019, continue to raise questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The case has also become part of the broader conversation about missing persons investigations, particularly cases involving young women whose disappearances may be connected to domestic violence. Allison's story has been featured in true crime podcasts, news documentaries, and online discussions that seek to keep unsolved cases in public awareness. As we conclude this journey through the mystery of Allison Watterson's disappearance and death, it's important to remember that behind all the investigative details and unanswered questions was a real person whose life was cut tragically short. Allison was 20 years old when she died, an age when most people are just beginning to discover who they're going to become as adults. She had dreams, relationships, and plans for the future that would never be realized. The tattoos on her body told stories about her personality and interests that we can only glimpse through the details that survived her death. Her family's dedication to finding her, evidenced by months of private searches and advocacy, speaks to the love that surrounded her during her life. Even in their grief, they continued to fight for answers and justice, refusing to let her disappearance fade into the background of other news and concerns. The Oregon forests where Allison spent her final hours are places of natural beauty, where towering trees and misty mornings create landscapes that feel almost sacred. It seems particularly tragic that such a peaceful setting became the backdrop for whatever violence or misfortune ended her young life. For those who knew her personally, Allison's death represents not just the loss of a life, but the loss of all the experiences and relationships that would have filled the decades she should have had ahead of her. Friends who will never get to see what kind of adult she would have become, family members who will forever wonder about the conversations they never got to have, and perhaps children who will never be born because their mother's story ended too soon. The mystery surrounding her death means that even in remembering her, questions persist about the circumstances that led to her disappearance from the world. But perhaps the most important thing to remember about Allison Joy Watterson is not how her story ended, but that it began with promise and love, and that her loss continues to be felt by people who cared about her. In the quiet forests of Oregon, where mist still drifts between the trees on winter mornings, the questions about what happened to a young woman named Allison remain unanswered. But her memory persists, carried by family members who refuse to forget, and by communities that continue to seek justice for lives lost too soon. The search for truth in Allison's case continues, even as this story ends. Somewhere in the evidence yet to be fully analyzed, in the memories of witnesses yet to come forward, or in the conscience of someone who knows more than they've revealed, the answers may still be waiting. Until those answers come, Allison Joy Watterson remains both a mystery and a reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of seeking justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves, and the enduring power of love to transcend even death. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. There are moments in life when everything seems perfect from the outside looking in. Social media feeds filled with golden sunsets, smiling faces, and adventures that make others dream of their own escape from routine. But sometimes, beneath those carefully curated images, a darker reality unfolds, one that the world only discovers when it's too late to change the ending. This is the story of Gabrielle Venora Petito, known to her friends and family simply as Gabby. It's a story that captivated the nation in the fall of 2021, not just because of its tragic ending, but because it felt so familiar, so close to home. Gabby was 22 years old, full of dreams and wanderlust, planning what she hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime. Instead, it became a journey that would end in the remote wilderness of Wyoming, far from the Long Island home where she grew up. Gabby Petito wasn't born into extraordinary circumstances. She grew up in Blue Point, New York, a quiet community on Long Island where neighbors knew each other's names and teenagers gathered at the local pizza shops after school. She was the kind of young woman who lit up a room when she entered it, blonde hair that caught the sunlight, an infectious laugh, and an enthusiasm for life that drew people to her like moths to a flame. At Bayport Blue Point High School, Gabby was popular but not in the way that creates enemies. She was genuinely kind, the type of person who remembered your birthday and asked about your sick grandmother. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, often said that Gabby had been born with an old soul, someone who seemed to understand people in ways that took others decades to learn. It was at this same high school that Gabby first met Brian Christopher Laundrie. He was a year older, tall and lean with dark hair and an intensity that some found magnetic and others found unsettling. Brian wasn't as naturally social as Gabby, but there was something about him that intrigued her. Perhaps it was the way he could talk for hours about books and philosophy, or maybe it was how he seemed to need her in a way that made her feel important, essential. They became friends first, the way many high school relationships do, starting with shared glances across the cafeteria and evolving into long conversations that stretched past curfew. After Brian graduated in 2017, they kept in touch, and by 2019, what had been friendship blossomed into something more serious. Love, or what they believed was love at 17 and 19 years old. That same year, Gabby made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life. She left New York, leaving behind her family, her friends, and the familiar rhythms of Long Island life, to move to North Point, Florida. She moved in with Brian and his family, his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, and his sister Cassie. To the outside world, it looked like a young couple taking the next step in their relationship. To those who knew Gabby best, it felt like she was slowly disappearing into Brian's world. Florida was different from New York in ways that went beyond geography. The Laundrie household operated by different rules, different expectations. Brian's parents seemed to accept Gabby readily enough, but there was always an understanding that this was Brian's territory, his family, his home that she was now sharing. For someone as independent as Gabby had been, this shift was more challenging than she had anticipated. But Gabby adapted, as young people in love often do. She found work, made new friends, and threw herself into building a life with Brian. They moved into their own apartment, and for a while, it seemed like everything was falling into place. They talked about marriage, about the future, about all the places they wanted to see together. It was during this time that Gabby discovered something that would become both her passion and, ultimately, part of her undoing, the world of social media influence and travel blogging. She had always loved photography and had an eye for capturing beautiful moments, but the rise of Instagram and YouTube opened up possibilities she had never considered. By 2020, van life had become more than just a trend, it was a movement. Across social media platforms, young couples were documenting their lives on the road, converting vans into mobile homes and trading traditional stability for adventure and freedom. For Gabby, who had always felt most alive when exploring new places, this lifestyle represented everything she wanted. She began following van life influencers religiously, studying their content, learning about their journeys. She dreamed of having her own channel, sharing her adventures with the world, maybe even making enough money to sustain life on the road. It wasn't just about the money, though, it was about the community, the connection with people who valued experiences over possessions. Brian, initially, seemed less enthusiastic about the idea. He was more of a reader than a performer, more comfortable with deep conversations than with putting himself on display for strangers on the internet. But Gabby's excitement was contagious, and eventually, he began to see the appeal. They started planning what would be their maiden voyage, a 4-month journey across the United States, hitting national parks and documenting everything for Gabby's YouTube channel, which they decided to call Nomadic Fanatic. The planning took months. They researched routes, studied maps, and saved money. They bought a 2012 Ford Transit van, white and practical, and began the process of converting it into a livable space. Brian, who was handy with tools, took charge of most of the renovation work, while Gabby focused on the aesthetic details and the technical aspects of filming and editing. The van, when finished, was cramped but efficient. There was a bed that doubled as a seating area, a small kitchen setup, storage compartments built into every available space. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs, and in Gabby's mind, it represented freedom and possibility. Their social media presence began to grow even before they left Florida. Gabby posted photos of the van renovation, of their planning sessions, of her excitement about the journey ahead. Friends and family commented with support and admiration. Her stepfather, Jim Schmidt, later said that he had never seen Gabby more excited about anything in her life. But those closest to her also began to notice subtle changes in Gabby during this planning period. She seemed more anxious than usual, more eager to please Brian, more willing to defer to his preferences even when they conflicted with her own. When friends asked about it, she brushed off their concerns. This was just the stress of planning such a big trip, she said. Everything would be better once they were on the road. On July 2, 2021, Gabby and Brian officially began their cross-country adventure. They left from New York after visiting with Gabby's family, the van packed with supplies, camera equipment, and hopes for what lay ahead. Gabby's last in-person conversation with her mother was filled with excitement and nervous energy. She promised to call regularly, to share her location, to be careful. The first few weeks of the trip seemed to go according to plan. Their social media accounts showed beautiful landscapes, the couple smiling together in front of national monuments, artistic shots of the van parked against stunning backdrops. Gabby's Instagram posts carried captions full of wonder and gratitude. "Traveling has been a beautiful, beautiful thing for us," she wrote in one post. "It's really brought us closer." They visited Arches National Park in Utah, where Gabby posted photos that would later be analyzed frame by internet sleuths trying to piece together the timeline of what went wrong. They explored Colorado, camping in remote locations and documenting their experiences for the YouTube channel that was slowly gaining subscribers. But beneath the surface of these picture-perfect posts, cracks were beginning to show. Those who knew how to look could see signs of strain in some of the photos, forced smiles, tension in body language, captions that seemed to be trying too hard to convince the reader that everything was wonderful. The reality, which wouldn't be fully understood until much later, was that life in the van was far more difficult than either of them had anticipated. The close quarters, the lack of privacy, the constant pressure to create content, and the stress of living on a tight budget created a powder keg of tension between two people who were already struggling with fundamental incompatibilities in their relationship. Brian, it would later emerge, had a temper that he struggled to control, especially when he felt criticized or challenged. Gabby, for her part, had developed anxiety that sometimes manifested in ways that Brian found irritating. The combination was toxic, and the isolation of the road trip meant there was no escape valve, no opportunity to step away and gain perspective. Their first major crisis came in Moab, Utah, on August 12, 2021. What happened that day would be captured on police body cameras and later dissected by millions of viewers, but the full truth of what led to that moment is still debated. It was a hot Thursday afternoon when a concerned citizen called the Grand County Sheriff's Office in Moab, Utah. The caller reported seeing a man hitting a woman outside a store, and the woman appeared to be trying to get away from him. The caller provided a description of the couple and their distinctive white van, which police were able to locate a short time later. Officer Eric Pratt pulled over the van, and what followed was recorded on body cameras that would later be viewed millions of times online. The footage shows Gabby and Brian after what was clearly an intense altercation. Gabby is visibly distraught, crying and struggling to explain what had happened. Brian appears calmer, more controlled, but there's a tension in his demeanor that's unmistakable. In the video, Gabby takes responsibility for the incident, describing herself as the aggressor. She tells the officers that she had been anxious about Brian's criticism of her work on their blog, that she had hit him first, that she had been experiencing mental health struggles that made her really mean sometimes. She apologizes repeatedly, both to the officers and to Brian, as if the entire situation is her fault. Brian's version of events supports Gabby's account, but something about his demeanor struck observers as off. He seemed almost pleased that Gabby was taking the blame, quick to agree with her characterization of herself as the problem in their relationship. When describing Gabby's behavior, he used words like crazy and painted himself as the patient, long-suffering boyfriend of an unstable woman. The officers, faced with a situation where both parties agreed that Gabby had been the physical aggressor, made a decision that would later be heavily criticized. Rather than making an arrest, they separated the couple for the night. Gabby stayed in the van, while Brian was put up in a hotel room. The idea was to give them space to cool down and hopefully resolve whatever issues had led to the confrontation. What the officers didn't see, what couldn't be captured on body camera footage, was the deeper dynamic at play in this relationship. The body camera footage shows only a snapshot, a moment frozen in time, but it doesn't show the weeks of psychological pressure that may have led to that moment, or the pattern of behavior that friends and family were only beginning to understand. Later analysis of the incident would reveal that several red flags were missed. Domestic violence experts pointed out that Gabby's behavior in the video, taking blame, minimizing Brian's role, apologizing excessively, was consistent with someone in an abusive relationship. Her visible anxiety and distress, combined with Brian's calm manipulation of the narrative, painted a picture that should have been more alarming to the responding officers. But at the time, the incident was treated as a minor domestic dispute between young people under stress. They were separated for one night, given some advice about managing conflict, and sent on their way. The police report classified it as a mental health crisis rather than domestic violence. The decision to let them continue their trip together would later be seen as a critical missed opportunity. For Gabby, that night in the van alone might have been her last chance to call for help, to reach out to family, to reconsider the journey. But she didn't. Whether because she couldn't or because she still hoped things would get better, she stayed with the plan. The next morning, the couple reunited and continued their journey. To their social media followers, nothing seemed different. Gabby continued posting photos, continued writing captions about the beauty of their adventure. But those who knew her best later said that something in her tone had shifted after Moab. Her posts became less frequent, her calls home became shorter and more strained. After the Moab incident, Gabby and Brian continued their journey, but something had fundamentally changed between them. Friends and family who spoke to Gabby during this time later described her as seeming different, more withdrawn, more anxious, less like the vibrant young woman who had set out on the adventure with such high hopes. Their route took them through some of the most beautiful landscapes in the American West. They visited Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, where Gabby posted what would be among her final Instagram photos. The images show her standing in front of stunning mountain vistas, but those who knew her well could see something in her expression that wasn't quite right. The smile seemed forced, the captions less enthusiastic than usual. During this time, Gabby was maintaining contact with her family through text messages and phone calls, but these communications were becoming increasingly sporadic and strange. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, later said that she could sense something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The calls felt rushed, Gabby seemed distracted, and there were gaps in communication that were unusual for her daughter, who normally checked in regularly. On August 27, 2021, according to the FBI's later investigation, Brian Laundrie killed Gabby Petito alongside Spread Creek in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. The exact circumstances of her death would remain somewhat unclear, but an autopsy determined that the manner of death was homicide by blunt force injuries to the head and neck, with manual strangulation. What happened in those final moments between Gabby and Brian may never be fully known. There were no witnesses, no video evidence, no clear record of what led to the fatal altercation. But investigators and those close to the case believe that the tensions that had been building throughout their relationship, exacerbated by the stress of the journey and their recent conflicts, finally reached a breaking point. After killing Gabby, Brian apparently made a calculated decision. Rather than calling for help or turning himself in, he chose to cover up the crime and flee. He left Gabby's body in the wilderness area near their campsite, took their van, and began the long drive back to Florida. The exact timeline of his journey home isn't completely clear, but investigators believe he drove almost non-stop, desperate to get back to familiar territory before anyone realized Gabby was missing. During this same period, Gabby's family was growing increasingly worried about the lack of communication. Her mother had received text messages that were supposedly from Gabby, but they didn't sound like her daughter. The language was off, the tone was wrong, and Nicole Schmidt had a growing suspicion that someone else was sending these messages. The last text message that Nicole received, supposedly from Gabby, was sent on August 30, 2021. It read, "No service in Yosemite." But Gabby wasn't in Yosemite, she was already dead in Wyoming, and Brian was likely already on his way back to Florida. This text, investigators believe, was sent by Brian using Gabby's phone in an attempt to buy himself more time before her disappearance was discovered. On September 1, 2021, Brian Laundrie arrived back at his parents' home in North Point, Florida, driving Gabby's white van. He was alone. Neighbors who saw him that day later described him as seeming agitated and strange, but not necessarily panicked. He immediately went into the house and, according to later reports, told his parents some version of what had happened. What exactly Brian told his parents, and when he told them, would become a matter of intense speculation and legal scrutiny. The Laundrie family hired a lawyer almost immediately, which suggested they understood the seriousness of the situation. But they didn't call the police, didn't report Gabby missing, and didn't encourage Brian to turn himself in. For over a week, the Laundrie family maintained their silence while Gabby's family grew increasingly frantic. Nicole Schmidt was calling and texting Brian's phone, begging for information about her daughter. She was getting no response. She tried calling the Laundrie family directly, still nothing. It was as if Gabby had simply vanished from the face of the earth. During this time, Brian was apparently trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. Neighbors reported seeing him working on the van, cleaning it inside and out. He was spotted at a local library using the computers, though what he was researching remains unknown. His parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, were seen going about their regular routines, giving no indication that anything was amiss. The silence from the Laundrie family was particularly cruel for Gabby's relatives, who knew that Brian was the last person to have seen their daughter alive. They pleaded with him through intermediaries to just tell them where Gabby was, even if something terrible had happened. They said they wouldn't press charges if he would just help them find her. But Brian, on the advice of his lawyer, said nothing. On September 11, 2021, exactly 10 days after Brian had returned to Florida alone, Nicole Schmidt finally made the decision that would change everything. Unable to reach her daughter and getting no cooperation from Brian or his family, she filed a missing person report with the Suffolk County Police Department in New York. The report immediately triggered a multi-state investigation. Police in Florida were contacted and asked to interview Brian as the last person known to have been with Gabby. When they arrived at the Laundrie home, they were met not by Brian but by his lawyer, who informed them that his client would not be speaking to law enforcement. This refusal to cooperate immediately raised red flags. While it's certainly everyone's legal right to remain silent and request an attorney, the optics were terrible. Here was a young woman missing in the wilderness somewhere, and the person who knew her location was refusing to help. The story began to gain traction in local news, and then, almost overnight, it exploded into a national phenomenon. The case of Gabby Petito struck a chord with the American public in ways that few missing person cases do. Perhaps it was because she looked like so many other young women who had embraced the van life trend. Perhaps it was because her social media presence made her feel familiar, like someone viewers felt they knew personally. Or perhaps it was because the circumstances were so obviously suspicious that the public felt compelled to help solve the mystery. Within days of the missing person report being filed, social media sleuths had descended on the case with an intensity that was both helpful and concerning. They analyzed every photo Gabby had posted, looking for clues about her location. They studied Google Earth images of national parks, searching for the distinctive rock formations and landscapes that appeared in her final posts. They created detailed timelines and maps, tracking every confirmed sighting of the white van. The hashtag #FindGabbyPetito began trending on Twitter and TikTok. YouTube channels devoted to true crime began covering the case. Facebook groups formed where thousands of amateur investigators shared theories, tips, and observations. It was crowdsourced detective work on a scale that law enforcement had rarely seen before. Professional investigators, meanwhile, were following their own leads. They obtained cell phone records, interviewed friends and family members, and began the painstaking process of trying to retrace Gabby and Brian's route through the western United States. The social media attention, while sometimes overwhelming, also provided valuable tips. People who had seen the couple or their van during the trip came forward with information that helped narrow down their timeline and location. On September 14, 2021, Brian Laundrie was officially named as a person of interest in Gabby's disappearance. Police made it clear that he was not being charged with a crime at that point, but they desperately wanted to speak with him. The designation cranked up the media attention even further and increased the pressure on the Laundrie family. That same day, in a move that shocked investigators and the public alike, the Laundrie family reported that Brian himself was now missing. They claimed that he had left the family home on September 13 to go hiking in the Carlton Reserve, a vast wilderness area near their home, and had not returned. They said they were concerned for his safety. The timing of Brian's disappearance was immediately seen as suspicious. Just as the heat was being turned up, just as his name was being broadcast across the country as a person of interest in his fiancée's disappearance, he conveniently vanished into a swamp preserve that covered over 25,000 acres of difficult terrain. Some observers suspected that Brian's disappearance was staged, that his family was helping him evade law enforcement. Others believed that he might have harmed himself out of guilt or fear of facing justice. Still others thought he might be alive and on the run, possibly with help from his family. The search for Brian Laundrie began almost immediately, but the Carlton Reserve presented enormous challenges. It's a mixture of swampland, dense forest, and scrub terrain that's home to alligators, snakes, and other dangers. The area is crisscrossed with hiking trails but also contains vast stretches that are virtually impenetrable. Finding one person in such terrain would be like finding a needle in a haystack. While the search for Brian was getting underway in Florida, the search for Gabby was intensifying in Wyoming. Investigators had narrowed down their search area based on social media posts, cell phone data, and eyewitness accounts from other campers. The focus was on the area around Grand Teton National Park, where Gabby's last confirmed posts had been made. On September 19, 2021, after 8 days of intensive searching, the worst fears of Gabby's family were confirmed. Her body was discovered in a remote area of the Bridger Teton National Forest, near a camping area along Spread Creek. The location was consistent with the timeline that investigators had constructed based on her social media posts and other evidence. The discovery was made by a team of investigators working methodically through the area where they believed Gabby and Brian had been camping. Her remains were found in an area that was somewhat concealed from the main trail, suggesting that whoever left her there had made at least a minimal attempt to hide the body. It was believed by investigators that the scene was staged, though the specifics of what this meant were not immediately made public. The condition of the remains and the crime scene suggested that Gabby had been dead for several weeks, which was consistent with the timeline investigators had developed. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Brent Blue, the Teton County coroner, would later reveal the cause of death. The 22-year-old's death was caused by strangulation. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, confirming what everyone already suspected: Gabby Petito had been murdered. The discovery of Gabby's body transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a murder investigation. Brian Laundrie, who had been a person of interest in her disappearance, was now the prime suspect in her death. The pressure to find him intensified dramatically. For Gabby's family, the discovery brought the terrible certainty they had been dreading, but it also brought a form of relief. At least now they knew what had happened to their daughter. At least now she could be brought home for a proper burial. "I collapsed to the ground," her stepfather, Jim Schmidt, who went to Wyoming to identify her remains, later recalled. The public reaction to the discovery was intense. The case had already captured national attention, but the confirmation that this young woman, who had seemed so full of life in her social media posts, had been murdered created a wave of emotion across the country. Vigils were held in her honor. Her family received thousands of messages of support from strangers who felt personally invested in her story. At the same time, criticism began to mount about the handling of the case, particularly the police response to the domestic violence incident in Moab. Body camera footage of that encounter was released and analyzed extensively. Domestic violence experts pointed out the missed warning signs, the failure to properly assess the situation, and the decision to separate the couple for only one night rather than making an arrest. But the most pressing question remained: where was Brian Laundrie? With Gabby's death confirmed as a homicide and Brian as the primary suspect, the search for him became one of the most intensive manhunts in recent memory. The FBI took over the investigation, bringing significant resources to bear on finding Brian and determining exactly what had happened in Wyoming. The search of the Carlton Reserve continued day after day, with teams of law enforcement officers, K-9 units, and specialized search and rescue personnel combing through the difficult terrain. Helicopters flew overhead, drones were deployed, and every possible hiding spot was methodically checked. But the reserve was vast, and Brian had several days' head start if he was indeed hiding there. As the search continued, questions began to arise about the Laundrie family's role in Brian's disappearance. Had they helped him escape? Did they know where he was? Why had they waited so long to report him missing? The family's continued silence, maintained through their attorney, only fueled more speculation. Public anger toward the Laundrie family grew as the days passed. Protesters gathered outside their North Point home, demanding answers. Some carried signs with Gabby's picture, others chanted demands for justice. The family received death threats and had to have police protection. Their neighbors reported being harassed by internet sleuths who were convinced the family was hiding something. Meanwhile, investigators were building their case against Brian. They obtained search warrants for the family home, seizing computers, phones, and other potential evidence. They analyzed financial records, trying to track Brian's movements. They interviewed everyone who had come into contact with the couple during their trip, building a detailed timeline of their final weeks together. One particularly valuable piece of evidence came from a TikTok user named Miranda Baker, who had given Brian a ride near Grand Teton National Park on August 29, 2 days after Gabby's estimated death. Baker posted a video describing the encounter, noting that Brian had seemed agitated and had specifically asked her not to take him to Jackson Hole, where he claimed his fiancée was camping with friends. The ride was brief, but Baker remembered thinking that Brian's behavior was odd. This sighting was crucial because it helped establish that Brian was alone after Gabby's death and was attempting to create an alibi by claiming she was alive and camping elsewhere. It also showed that he was lying to strangers about her whereabouts, which was evidence of consciousness of guilt. As the search for Brian entered its second week, investigators made another important discovery. On September 23, 2021, the FBI announced that they had obtained a federal arrest warrant for Brian Laundrie, but not for Gabby's murder. Instead, he was charged with using unauthorized access devices, specifically, using Gabby's debit and credit cards after her death. Between August 30 and September 1, someone had made charges of more than $1,000 on accounts belonging to Gabby. Since she was already dead by this time, it could only have been Brian. This federal charge was strategic. It allowed law enforcement to officially classify Brian as a fugitive and to use additional resources in the search for him. It also meant that if he was found alive, they could arrest him immediately while they continued building the murder case. But Brian Laundrie was nowhere to be found. The search of the Carlton Reserve had turned up no trace of him despite the deployment of sophisticated technology and hundreds of searchers. Some began to wonder if he had ever been in the reserve at all, if the whole story of him going hiking there was a fabrication designed to throw off investigators. On October 20, 2021, after more than a month of searching, the mystery of Brian Laundrie's whereabouts was finally solved. His remains were discovered in the Carlton Reserve, not far from a trail he was known to frequent. The discovery was made by Brian's parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, who had joined the search that morning along with law enforcement officers. The location where his remains were found had been underwater for weeks due to seasonal flooding, which explained why previous searches had missed them. As the water receded, the area became accessible, and the remains became visible. Along with Brian's skeletal remains, investigators found personal items that confirmed his identity: a backpack, a notebook, and other belongings. Most significantly, they found a .38 caliber revolver. An autopsy report by the Sarasota, Florida, medical examiner stated Laundrie died from a gunshot wound to the head. The discovery answered the question of whether Brian was dead or alive, but it raised new questions about the timing and circumstances of his death. Had he killed himself immediately after returning to Florida, overwhelmed by guilt? Had he survived in the wilderness for weeks before taking his own life? The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exactly when he had died. More importantly, Brian's death meant that many questions about Gabby's murder would never be answered. There would be no trial, no opportunity for her family to confront her killer, no chance for the full truth to come out in court. Brian had taken his secrets to the grave. The notebook found with Brian's remains would later prove crucial to understanding his final thoughts. Though water-damaged, investigators were able to extract enough text to piece together what amounted to a confession. In the notebook, the FBI revealed that Laundrie admitted to killing his fiancée. The notebook entries painted a picture of a man who claimed he had killed Gabby out of mercy, saying she was injured and suffering. But investigators and Gabby's family rejected this narrative, noting that the autopsy showed she had died by strangulation, not from injuries that would require someone to end her suffering. They viewed Brian's version of events as a final attempt to portray himself as something other than a cold-blooded killer. The deaths of both Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie brought a tragic end to a case that had captivated the nation for weeks. But the conclusion of the criminal investigation didn't bring closure for everyone involved. Gabby's family was left to grieve not just her death, but also the fact that they would never get the full truth about what happened to her. The case had broader implications that extended far beyond the individuals involved. It sparked important conversations about domestic violence, particularly the subtle forms of abuse that can be difficult to detect from the outside. Experts pointed out that Brian's behavior in the Moab police encounter, his calm demeanor, his willingness to let Gabby take the blame, his subtle manipulation of the narrative, were classic signs of an abusive partner. The massive media attention the case received also highlighted troubling disparities in how missing person cases are covered. Gabby was a young, attractive white woman whose social media presence made her relatable to many people. Critics pointed out that missing persons from minority communities, particularly Indigenous women, rarely receive the same level of attention despite facing higher rates of violence. The case sparked discussions about missing white woman syndrome and the need for more equitable coverage of all missing persons cases. The role of social media in both the relationship between Gabby and Brian and in the investigation of her disappearance also raised important questions. The pressure to maintain a perfect online image may have prevented Gabby from revealing the problems in her relationship. At the same time, the crowdsourced investigation that developed on social media platforms was both helpful and problematic, providing valuable tips to investigators while also spreading misinformation and harassment. For law enforcement, the case served as a learning experience about domestic violence intervention. The Moab Police Department faced significant criticism for their handling of the August 12 incident, and the case became a teaching moment for officers across the country about recognizing the signs of intimate partner abuse. Gabby's family channeled their grief into advocacy, working to raise awareness about domestic violence and to help other families of missing persons. They established the Gabby Petito Foundation, dedicated to providing resources for people in abusive relationships and supporting the families of missing persons. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, became a vocal advocate for domestic violence prevention. The legal aftermath also continued long after Brian's death. Gabby's family filed a civil lawsuit against the Moab Police Department, alleging that the officer's failure to properly handle the domestic violence incident contributed to her death. The lawsuit highlighted the critical importance of proper training and response in domestic violence situations. There were also legal battles involving the Laundrie family. Brian's sister, Cassie Laundrie, eventually spoke publicly about the case, revealing tensions within the family and suggesting that she had been kept in the dark about many details. This created a rift in the Laundrie family that persisted long after the case was closed. The story of Gabby Petito is ultimately a story about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect relationships. Her social media posts showed a young couple living their dreams, exploring beautiful places, and sharing adventures. But those carefully curated images hid a darker reality, a relationship marked by control, manipulation, and ultimately, deadly violence. It's a reminder that domestic violence doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It doesn't always involve obvious physical abuse or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's subtle, psychological, a gradual erosion of someone's sense of self-worth and independence. Gabby appeared strong and confident in her photos, but those who knew her best later recognized signs that she was being emotionally manipulated and controlled. The case also illustrates how quickly a situation can escalate from psychological abuse to lethal violence. Whatever happened in those final moments in Wyoming, it was the culmination of a relationship dynamic that had been building for months or years. Brian's decision to kill Gabby, whatever triggered it, was the ultimate expression of the control he had been exerting over her throughout their relationship. Perhaps most tragically, there were multiple points where intervention might have changed the outcome. If the officers in Moab had been better trained to recognize signs of domestic abuse. If Gabby had felt safe enough to reach out for help. If Brian had sought treatment for whatever psychological issues led him to become violent. If friends and family had been able to see past the social media facade to the reality of what was happening. But dwelling on what-ifs doesn't bring Gabby back or provide real comfort to those who loved her. What her story can do is serve as a warning and a call to action. It can help others recognize the signs of an abusive relationship before it's too late. It can encourage people to trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right about a friend's relationship. It can remind us all that the perfect lives we see on social media are often far from reality. In the end, Gabby Petito's story came full circle in the wilderness she had loved so much. She had set out on her journey seeking freedom, adventure, and connection with the natural world. Instead, she found her final resting place in the remote forests of Wyoming, far from the family and friends who cherished her. The Spread Creek area where her body was discovered is a place of stark beauty, rolling hills covered with sagebrush, distant mountains reaching toward endless skies. It's the kind of landscape that Gabby would have photographed, the kind of place she would have described in poetic captions about the majesty of the American West. The irony that such a beautiful place became the scene of such a terrible crime is not lost on those who knew her story. Visitors to the area now sometimes leave flowers or small mementos, a testament to how deeply her story affected strangers who never knew her in life. The wilderness that witnessed her final moments has become, in its own way, a memorial to a young woman whose dreams were cut tragically short. Her family has said that they find some comfort in knowing that Gabby spent her final week seeing some of the most beautiful places in America. Even in the midst of a relationship that was falling apart, even while facing pressures and fears she couldn't share with anyone, she was still experiencing the wonders of the natural world she had always loved. Her last Instagram posts, whatever pain lay behind them, still capture genuine moments of awe at the landscapes around her. The national parks and wilderness areas where Gabby traveled have always been places where people go to find themselves, to test their limits, to experience something greater than their everyday lives. For most visitors, these places provide exactly that, a chance for renewal and growth. But for Gabby, the isolation that makes wilderness areas so appealing also made them dangerous when she found herself trapped with someone who meant to harm her. Gabby Petito was just 22 years old when she died, barely an adult by most measures. She was at the age when most people are still figuring out who they are, what they want from life, what kind of relationships they want to have. She should have had decades ahead of her to grow, to learn from her experiences, to find real love and happiness. Instead, her life became a cautionary tale, a case study in the dangers of intimate partner violence. But those who knew her best don't want her to be remembered only as a victim. They want people to remember the vibrant, loving young woman she was, someone who lit up rooms when she entered them, who had genuine compassion for others, who dreamed of sharing the beauty of the world through her photography and writing. Her social media presence, which became such a crucial part of the investigation into her death, also serves as a reminder of who she was as a person. Yes, those posts may have hidden the difficulties in her relationship, but they also captured her genuine love of adventure, her eye for beauty, her enthusiasm for life. They show someone who was trying to build something positive, who wanted to inspire others to step outside their comfort zones and explore the world. The Gabby Petito Foundation, established by her family, works to ensure that her death was not entirely in vain. Through their advocacy and support work, they're helping other young people recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and find the resources they need to get help. They're also working to support the families of missing persons, providing resources and guidance to people navigating the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. Education about domestic violence has been another positive outcome of the intense attention Gabby's case received. Her story has been used in training programs for law enforcement officers, teaching them to better recognize and respond to domestic violence situations. It's been discussed in college courses about interpersonal relationships, helping young people understand what healthy relationships look like and when to seek help if they find themselves in dangerous situations. The Gabby Petito case also marked a turning point in how missing person investigations are conducted in the digital age. The massive crowdsourced investigation that developed on social media platforms was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Thousands of amateur sleuths combed through every piece of available evidence, analyzed photos and videos frame by frame, and provided tips that proved valuable to law enforcement. This level of public engagement was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the attention helped ensure that Gabby's disappearance didn't get lost in the system the way many missing person cases do. The public pressure kept law enforcement focused on the case and provided them with information they might never have found otherwise. The social media attention also meant that Brian Laundrie couldn't simply disappear and start a new life somewhere else, his face was too well known. On the other hand, the intense scrutiny also led to harassment of innocent people, the spread of misinformation, and interference with the official investigation. The Laundrie family, while hardly sympathetic figures, received death threats and had their lives disrupted by protesters and internet vigilantes. Other people who had the misfortune to resemble Brian Laundrie were falsely identified and harassed online. The case highlighted both the potential and the dangers of citizen journalism in the internet age. Social media platforms can be powerful tools for spreading awareness and gathering information, but they can also become echo chambers where speculation and rumor are treated as fact. The challenge for future cases will be finding ways to harness the positive aspects of public engagement while minimizing the potential for harm. Law enforcement agencies are still learning how to work with this new reality. The FBI and other agencies involved in the Gabby Petito case generally handled the media attention well, providing regular updates to keep the public informed while protecting the integrity of their investigation. But not all law enforcement agencies are prepared for the level of scrutiny and pressure that can develop when a case goes viral on social media. The impact of Gabby Petito's story extended far beyond her immediate family and friends. Across the country, young women in similar relationships began to question whether their situations were healthy. Domestic violence hotlines reported increased calls in the weeks following the intense media coverage of her case. College counseling centers saw more students seeking help for relationship issues. The case also had political implications, particularly around funding for domestic violence prevention and law enforcement training. Politicians cited Gabby's story when advocating for increased resources for domestic violence programs and better training for police officers who respond to domestic violence calls. In Utah, the Moab Police Department's handling of the August 12 incident led to policy changes and additional training. Other law enforcement agencies across the country also reviewed their domestic violence protocols and made adjustments based on lessons learned from the case. The case influenced popular culture as well. True crime podcasts dissected every aspect of the story. Documentary filmmakers began working on projects about the case. Writers and filmmakers drew inspiration from the story for fictional works exploring themes of domestic violence, social media, and the dark side of the American dream. But perhaps the most important ripple effect was on individual relationships. The case prompted countless conversations between friends, family members, and romantic partners about what healthy relationships look like. It encouraged people to check in with loved ones who might be in dangerous situations. It reminded everyone that the picture-perfect relationships we see on social media might not reflect reality. As we reach the end of Gabby Petito's story, it's important to remember that this isn't really an ending, it's a beginning. Her death sparked conversations and changes that continue to this day. Her family's advocacy work continues to help other families facing similar tragedies. The lessons learned from her case continue to influence how law enforcement, social services, and ordinary citizens respond to domestic violence situations. Gabby's story is ultimately about a young woman who had dreams and plans and hopes for the future, all of which were cut short by someone who claimed to love her. It's about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of relationships that look perfect from the outside. It's about the importance of trusting our instincts when something doesn't feel right, and the crucial need for better education and resources around domestic violence prevention. But it's also about the power of community and the refusal to let someone be forgotten. The thousands of people who joined the search for Gabby, who shared her story, who demanded justice for her, they ensured that her death would mean something, that it would lead to changes that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the day's distractions fade away and we're left with our thoughts, it's worth remembering Gabby Petito not just as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who loved adventure, who wanted to see the world, who dreamed of sharing beauty with others. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who laughed and cried and hoped and feared just like the rest of us. Her story reminds us to cherish the people we love, to pay attention to the warning signs when someone we care about might be in danger, and to never take for granted the simple gift of being alive and free to chase our dreams. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life had value, whose death represents not just a tragedy but a profound loss of all the good they might have done in the world. The wilderness of Wyoming still holds its secrets, and the wind that blows through the sagebrush carries stories of all who have passed that way. But now it also carries the memory of a young woman named Gabby, who came there seeking adventure and freedom, and who found instead a kind of peace that comes only when a story, however tragic, is finally told in full. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.